Daenerys Targaryen stood upon the sandy shores of the island where she and her Khalasar had made camp. The silver-gold braids in her hair whipped about in the stiff breeze that carried the faint taste of salt. Her gaze was drawn inevitably west, where a wide, unbroken expanse of shimmering water stretched all the way to the horizon. Rhaego, her son still sheltered within her womb, seemed to move inside her, a subtle shift that caused her hand to drift instinctively to her belly. She told herself it was a sign, an omen. He knew, even in his unborn state, that there was a destiny to be claimed across this sea, that it was not a matter of if they would cross, but when. Behind her, the Dothraki milled about with uneasy energy. They were horse lords, unaccustomed to large bodies of water, uncertain about leaving the familiar grasslands. The entire notion of traveling by ship, enormous wooden beasts that floated, but could also capsize and sink, was foreign and unsettling to many of them. Yet they followed her, the pale-haired Khaleesi who had captured their imaginations almost as much as her dragons might, if only she had them to show. For now, the eggs remained stone-like and precious, always nearby but slumbering. She was not yet the mother of dragons. That transformation in this changed fate would be shaped by other circumstances. Now, she was the wife of Khal Drogo, a looming figure of a man who commanded tens of thousands of riders. His Khalasar had grown uncommonly large, drawn by the strength of his name and by the mystique of the silver-haired girl who had once been a frightened child bride and had become something far more formidable. No war of the Five Kings had broken out yet in Westeros. Robert Baratheon still ruled as king, wearied perhaps by time and gluttony, but he clutched the Iron Throne all the same. Eddard Stark still lived in the north, loyal but uneasy in his stewardship of Winterfell. The Targaryen exiles remained a distant concern to the Seven Kingdoms' lords, whispers of a dragon princess who had married a horse lord to one day return. But in this altered weave of fate, Daenerys Targaryen's story diverged sooner. Where once she might have tarried in Essos until a chain of tragedies propelled her forward, she now stood on a narrow strip of coastline, preparing to do the unthinkable. Bring the Dothraki in all their fierce glory across the narrow sea before the realm was divided by civil war. Her brother Viserys was dead, the rightful penalty for daring to threaten the Khaleesi and incurring Drogo's wrath. She did not mourn him. A part of her felt pity at how small and bitter he had grown. But she did not mourn him. She could feel Ser Jorah Mormont approach from behind. He moved with a careful footstep so as not to startle her, though she did not startle easily anymore. The knight who had pledged himself to her service was watchful, always scanning for threats both visible and invisible. In these final days before the crossing, he had grown more concerned, more cautious. One did not ferry tens of thousands of Dothraki across an ocean without rousing suspicion and alarm along the coasts of Essos. Word had almost certainly reached King's Landing, though they would not yet credit such stories as anything more than rumor. "Your Grace," Jorah said softly when he drew near. The gruffness in his tone was underscored by a certain reverence he had never been able to hide since he first recognized Daenerys as the rightful queen. "The ships are ready. The captains have never carried so many horses before, but they're as prepared as they can be." Daenerys did not turn to face him immediately. Instead, she let her gaze linger a moment longer on the frothing waves. She inhaled the breeze, tasting the sea's tang, and exhaled slowly. "Are the riders afraid?" she asked, thinking of how the Dothraki dreaded crossing any water their horses could not gallop around. "Some," Jorah admitted, "but they trust their Khal and their Khaleesi. Most of them cannot imagine a foe that could frighten Khal Drogo enough to make him hesitate." Finally, Daenerys turned to look at the exiled knight. "Is Drogo ready?" Jorah's lips quirked into something close to a smile, but the wear of weeks of preparation tugged at the skin around his eyes. "Khal Drogo laughs at the sea. He says it's just another kind of plane, but one that belongs to you. He calls you Stormborn and says if you were born of salt and storm, then surely you will conquer the waters as well." A hint of a genuine grin appeared. "He is not afraid, Your Grace." Daenerys's heart warmed. Drogo was not a perfect man. The Dothraki were ruthless by the standards of Westeros, even savage. But in him, she had found an unbending strength, and when she allowed herself to think with unguarded sincerity, she loved him. He had given her a child, Rhaego, her son who would someday rule the world, as she had once imagined. Yet beyond that, Drogo had granted her a sense of confidence that she had never found living in her brother's shadow. She clasped her hands over her belly and lifted her head. "Then the crossing will begin at dawn," she said. "Make certain we have enough room for the horses and for the warriors to stay calm. We will cross in waves if needed. Some ships have already gone ahead to confirm the route and safe anchorage on the other side." For though they stood on the coastline of Essos near Pentos, the crossing was to be done methodically, ironically more carefully than most Westerosi armies ever conducted themselves. Because the Dothraki were not an army that marched, if they could not ride, they were almost powerless. Yet they would do it for her. She let her hand drift to the smooth cloth of her skirt, where she kept the 3 dragon eggs tied in a pouch. They were cool to the touch, unawakened, but she felt an affinity with them, an unspoken promise that her legacy was intertwined with them. She had no illusions about how terrifying the crossing would be for her people, but she could not wait any longer. Viserys might have hammered incessantly about the idea of taking back the Iron Throne, but he had never truly believed in what it would require, only in the dream that was long lost. Daenerys did not even know if she could muster the alliances or support, but she knew one thing. If she remained in Essos, the Targaryen name would only continue to wither. If she waited for the usurper's men to come for her, they would find her eventually. So she chose to press forward, to seize her destiny before the 7 kingdoms collapsed into what she feared might be chaos. Better to strike while the realm was unprepared for a foreign invasion than wait for it to rally all its defenses. And perhaps, she told herself, perhaps she could save them. From themselves, from the Lannisters' scheming, from the Baratheon cruelties. Perhaps she could even save them from the White Walkers, if the old stories whispered in hushed corners of the East were true. But that felt like a tale for another age. She would concern herself with more immediate obstacles first. In the days that followed, the Khalasar bustled with motion. Daenerys walked among the riders, speaking to them in their own tongue, smiling, touching the long braids that signified their prowess in battle. The Dothraki who had once gazed upon her with indifference and even scorn looked at her now with something akin to awe. She was a Khaleesi who faced no fear crossing the salt water. She had survived poisonings, betrayals, and her own brother's madness. She carried the future of their call in her womb. She was the mother of the stallion who mounts the world, if their prophecies came to pass. They did not speak of it often, except in hushed whispers around campfires, but she felt the weight of their expectancy. Drogo maintained his usual stoicism, though an undercurrent of excitement lit his eyes whenever he spoke of the 7 kingdoms. He imagined a continent of rolling fields where his riders could gallop free and plunder, each city a new conquest, each castle a new challenge. Sometimes, Daenerys tried to explain to him that Westeros was not like the plains of the Dothraki Sea. The lords and knights there would not simply bow, and the walls were tall, the gates fortified, the armies disciplined. But these words only made Drogo more eager. He was a warrior who had faced few true challenges in his lifetime. The notion of strong foes and high walls was thrilling, not daunting. The day finally arrived when the ships drew in close to the shore. Rowboats ferried men, horses, and supplies to the ships in a seemingly endless series of trips. The Dothraki shouted and cajoled their nervous mounts, for the horses smelled the salt and caught the tension in their riders. Wooden ramps groaned under the weight of hooves. Several of the horses panicked, nearly overturning a boat, but the riders managed to keep them calm or physically wrestle them into compliance. Daenerys boarded the largest ship, the one she had secured through the generosity of Illyrio Mopatis in Pentos, though whether Illyrio truly believed in her cause or merely saw some advantage in it, she could not say. She stood on deck next to Drogo, whose expression was watchful as the ship began to rock beneath them. A low mutter of curses spread through the assembled Dothraki, unused to the sensation of a wooden deck moving in unpredictable swells, but Drogo gripped the rail, laughing. "See, moon of my life?" he said to Daenerys, reverting to the language of his people. "This sea is a living beast, trembling in fear. It knows I am Khal Drogo." He slapped the rail as though it were the flank of a horse. "It will carry us to your iron chair, and then you will seat yourself upon it with your stallion who mounts the world beside you." Daenerys placed her hand on his forearm. She felt warmth flood her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to smile. Perhaps they would succeed. The idea that she might take the Iron Throne, that the Seven Kingdoms might know a queen unlike any other, was a spark of hope in her chest. The journey itself proved grueling for many of the Dothraki. A storm caught their fleet partway across the water, hurling monstrous waves at the ships. Several horses were lost when panic caused them to smash through barriers or slip on sodden, tilting decks. Daenerys tended to the fearsome warriors who were brought low by seasickness. She soothed them with soft words and songs, surprising them with her kindness. Some looked on Drogo, expecting him to roar at his people for their weakness, but he merely watched in silence, a small frown upon his brow. The storm shook the ships all through one long night, howling winds and the cracking of sails. Daenerys clutched her dragon eggs tight and prayed to the gods, both the old gods of Westeros and the strange gods of the Dothraki, to see them through. When dawn broke over calm seas, hope rose anew. The fleet had scattered, but in the days that followed, they regrouped near a small rocky isle to mend sails and count their losses. Only a handful of the ships had been lost entirely, along with more horses than Daenerys cared to admit. But enough of the khalasar survived to still be a fearsome host. By the time the coasts of Westeros appeared as a green and brown slash on the horizon, the Dothraki had begun to take the rocking of the ships as a challenge to be endured, like any other hardship on the endless plains. They had survived, and in that survival they found renewed confidence. Drogo seemed eager, pacing the deck like a caged lion. Though rumors had reached the Red Keep of King's Landing, it was one thing to hear whispers of a Dothraki horde crossing the sea and quite another to stand on the battlements of a coastal fortress and see the sails with one's own eyes. By the time Daenerys' scattered fleet made landfall in the storm-blasted shores near Crackclaw Point, they met only a small, frightened garrison of local lords' men. The watchers on the walls were too few, too poorly equipped to offer serious resistance. Daenerys was uncertain how to proceed, but Drogo's instincts as a Khal took over the moment they touched land. He ordered a swift night raid, leaving enough men to secure the ships and unload the horses. The next day, the castle gate was thrown open by terrified men who knew they stood no chance against tens of thousands of Dothraki screamers. And so Daenerys Targaryen set foot on Westerosi soil before any formal word of war had gone out. Only the ravens that flew frantically from Crackclaw Point to King's Landing and to the Eyrie and to Riverrun would carry the news. The Dothraki had come to Westeros. At their head was a silver-haired Targaryen princess, the wife of Khal Drogo. Before the War of the Five Kings ever had a chance to begin, a foreign invasion threatened the peace of the realm. Those first days on Westerosi shores blurred by in a haze of conquest. The Dothraki galloped unopposed through the rural lands. Some local lords attempted to muster their forces, only to be overwhelmed by the swiftness of the riders. Daenerys struggled to keep them from the pillaging and slaughter that was second nature to them. She knew she had to strike a balance between allowing the Dothraki their customary spoils of war and ensuring the common folk did not view her as just another tyrant. She wanted them to see her as a liberator, not a destroyer. But for the moment, survival and momentum demanded compromise. Ser Jorah counseled her daily, reminding her of local allegiances. House Valerion holds certain coastal lands to the south, Your Grace. They have been sworn to House Targaryen in the past, centuries past, but it's a connection worth remembering. If we can secure their goodwill, or at least their neutrality, we could ensure safer passage by sea and find a route to King's Landing. But I must warn you, Robert Baratheon will move quickly once he believes the threat is real. She remembered King Robert only as a name, the usurper who had slain her brother Rhaegar on the Trident, the man who had seized her family's throne, run her mother and father to ruin, and scattered the Targaryen line to the winds. She felt anger kindle in her heart, hot and bright. She pressed a hand protectively over her belly. "Then let him move," she said quietly. "We will face him. We should also consider alliances, Your Grace." Jorah pressed gently. A single house that bends the knee might set an example, especially if they remember your family's days of rule with fondness. She nodded, though a part of her still felt the rawness of it all. She was new to Westeros, a stranger even in her homeland. There was an entire realm of people who might not even remember the Targaryen rule. Her father, the Mad King, had left a bitter legacy. "We will seek alliances," she confirmed, "but I will not beg for them. Let them see we are strong." Drogo agreed with that sentiment wholeheartedly. The wide fields of the Crownlands, the lush hills, these were new horse plains to him, an endless realm ripe for riding. He took Daenerys on long rides, galloping far beyond the perimeter of their camp. The wind whipped at her hair, and she felt a sense of freedom mingled with dread. The knowledge that every league they advanced brought them closer to the seat of power, the Iron Throne. She often dreamed of dragons in those nights, huge shapes swirling overhead on red skies. She woke to quiet dawns, with only the faint shifting of the dragon eggs to remind her that something inside them might still live. From King's Landing, ravens flew in every direction. Robert Baratheon, bullish and battered by age but still dangerous, called his banners. He wrote letters to Lords Arryn, Stark, Lannister, Tyrell, and Martell. Across the Seven Kingdoms, men paused their daily routines, sharpened swords, prepared to march. But no official war had been declared among the great houses themselves. Instead, something resembling unity took hold, for the threat was foreign. Targaryen, the name many had learned to fear or scorn. Old loyalties stirred in some hearts, but for most, the call to arms was simple. The kingdom had been invaded. Robert's fury was stoked. He demanded heads. He remembered the ghosts of the past, the Targaryen scions who had escaped him. He had sworn to see the end of their line. Now, hearing that Daenerys had grown strong on the other side of the sea, strong enough to bring an entire horde, he raged that none of his advisors had acted sooner. None had listened when the girl was in Pentos or in the Dothraki Sea. The fruit of that inaction was now galloping across his kingdom, capturing small castles and scattering the local lords. But for all his anger, Robert Baratheon was not a fool. He commanded the realm's resources as king. Troops mustered. The royal fleet set sail northward, attempting to blockade or at least harass any further landing parties. Already, noble houses that had long feuded put aside their grievances to meet this threat. Some recalled the Field of Fire, when Aegon the Conqueror had unleashed dragons upon the assembled armies. But the rumors said this Targaryen had no dragons, only eggs. And that was a crucial difference. Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, received Robert's summons with a heavy heart. He did not trust the king's small council. Littlefinger was cunning, Varys secretive, Pycelle unctuous, and Renly too naive in some ways. But Robert needed him. So Ned marched south, leaving Robb in Winterfell's care with his wife Catelyn. He did not relish a war. The Targaryen princess, from all he knew, was little more than a child woman forced into exile. And yet, here she was, leading a horde of savage horse lords. He tried to quell any sympathy he might have felt. Duty demanded he stand by the king, for the sake of the realm. And so the wheels turned, forging alliances that had not yet fractured along the lines that might have come to pass had events gone differently. It was in the quiet hours of morning that Daenerys prayed in the yard of a conquered keep. They had moved west, skirting the coast, capturing a series of small strongholds. Many of the local lords had yielded without a fight after seeing the speed of the Dothraki. She pressed her palm to her belly. Rhaego was stirring within her more strongly these days. She could feel every twist, every shift. Yora approached, bowing slightly. "Your Grace," he said. "Scouts report a large force gathering to the south. Royal banners, Baratheon stags, and I hear talk of the gold of House Lannister as well." His voice was heavy. Daenerys lifted her head, finding her courage in the swirl of the early wind. "They have come to stop us. Then we will speak to them." Yora seemed uncertain. Khal Drogo has no interest in treaties. She thought of Drogo, of how unstoppable he seemed astride his warhorse, but also of how he might see negotiation as a weakness. "We must try," she replied. I don't wish to see this realm destroyed. It is my birthright, and these are my people, even if they don't yet know it. She could almost imagine the realm ablaze if the Dothraki and Robert's forces clashed head-on. Even without dragons, the devastation would be terrifying. She went to Drogo, explained her plan. He listened, arms folded, eyes unreadable. "The Iron Throne is yours by right," he said at last. "That is what we said when we joined. You wished to cross the poison water to claim it. I have done this for you. Why should we bargain with those who have what you desire?" She placed a hand on his chest. "Because the men of this kingdom know only that I am my father's daughter. They remember his madness, his cruelty. If I can show them that I am not the same, perhaps they will yield without a war. If they do not yield, then we will do what must be done." She felt her heart pound. She was not the timid girl of old. She had grown strong among the Dothraki, tempered by hardship. She was a Khaleesi, but she also knew that leadership sometimes meant choosing a path that preserved more lives. Drogo glanced at her belly, then back to her face. For a moment, a flicker of something like respect glinted in his dark eyes. "We will speak to them," he conceded. "But if they insult us, they die." A raven was sent south with a message scrawled on parchment. Formal words from Daenerys Targaryen, first of her name, Queen of the Undulls and the Rhoynar and the First Men, to Robert Baratheon, styling himself King of the Seven Kingdoms. She invited him or his envoys to parley. She declared that she claimed the throne by blood and was willing to negotiate the terms of his abdication to avoid needless bloodshed. A bold letter, some might have said arrogant. Ser Jorah reminded her that Robert was not known for his diplomacy. But she persisted. The raven flew off. She waited, breath taut in her chest. Days passed. Scouts reported that the royal host was moving steadily north, as if aiming to surround the Dothraki or drive them into a corner. The tension in the Khalasar rose. The riders whispered about betrayal, about the need to strike first. Daenerys insisted they wait, hoping the parley would come. And indeed, one late afternoon, a small band of knights bearing Baratheon banners came into sight, carrying a white flag of truce. Daenerys rode out to meet them. At her side was Drogo, resplendent upon his warhorse, his braid heavy with bells that chimed as he moved. Ser Jorah rode behind them, flanked by a half-dozen of Drogo's blood riders. They met in a small clearing, where the grass was tall and bright green under the sun. The knights were 5 in number, each in battered but serviceable armor. The eldest, gray-bearded with a stern set to his jaw, dismounted carefully. He introduced himself as Ser John Penrose of King's Landing, an emissary for King Robert. Daenerys swung down from her horse with all the poise she had learned. She walked forward with her head high. Drogo remained mounted, gazing down at the men, an imposing presence that reminded them of the danger here. Ser John bowed stiffly. "Your Grace, I come on behalf of King Robert Baratheon. He has received your letter. He sends word that if you and your horse lords depart Westeros at once, never to return, he will forget this trespass." Daenerys studied the older man's face, searching for any sign of doubt or fear. She found both, but also loyalty. She recalled the lines of the letter she had sent, imagining how Robert must have fumed upon reading it. "I crossed the narrow sea to claim my birthright," she said in a calm voice. "I will not leave." Ser John's eyes flicked to the Dothraki around her. "Then my king bids me tell you, you will find only death if you persist in this madness. He has the might of the 7 kingdoms at his back." Drogo snorted, translating the man's words roughly in his mind. When Daenerys provided the meaning, his scowl deepened. "They speak of death," he said in the Dothraki tongue. "They do not know death." Daenerys felt a stealing resolve inside her. "Is that all your king has to say?" Ser John hesitated. "He also wishes me to convey an offer. He will grant you a small keep and lands in perpetuity, on condition that you renounce all claims to the throne and remain forever under his authority, so long as you live." The offer was insulting in its obvious attempt to humiliate. Drogo's hands tightened on his reins, and a wave of tension passed through the Khalasar behind them. Daenerys forced herself to stay calm. "You know my answer to that," she said. "Tell him there is but one outcome I will accept. The Iron Throne will be mine, or I will die trying to take it." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the nights. "If King Robert wishes to avoid bloodshed, let him come. Kneel. Surrender the throne he took from my family. Or stand against us and suffer the fate of all those who defy the will of House Targaryen." She felt a tremor inside her, part fear, part exultation. She saw the color drain from Ser John's face. "You are your father's daughter," he said, voice low with shock or perhaps rage. "My father's crimes are not mine," she replied coldly. "But I will not be frightened away from what is mine by right." There was no more to say. Ser John gave her a stiff bow and climbed onto his horse. Daenerys watched as the 5 knights rode off. For a moment, she felt the enormity of her decision crash down on her. She had effectively declared war on the 7 kingdoms. She felt Drogo's hand on her shoulder, a reassuring weight. "You did well, moon of my life," he said. "The Iron Men will come. We will crush them." She nodded, yet a sense of unease gnawed at her. She knew the host that awaited them was large, disciplined, better supplied. The Dothraki had never faced knights in full plate or the arrow volleys of trained archers. Yet they were formidable in their own right, swift and deadly. She had Yora's counsel and she had cunning. She prayed that would be enough. The next weeks were a flurry of movement. The Dothraki scoured the countryside. Drogo favored open fields. He wished to draw the royal host out into the plains where the horse lords could maneuver freely, cutting down footmen before they could brace. Daenerys, however, was mindful that the Baratheon forces might try to press them against the coast or trap them in the hilly regions. She ordered some of her people to learn the lay of the land, something the Dothraki had never cared to do in their own realm, for the wide seas of grass had been all they needed to know. But here, knowledge of every stream, every copse of forest, might make the difference. Near Duskendale, the first major clash occurred. Robert's outriders stumbled upon a raiding party of Dothraki near the Rosby Road. Battle was joined, a brief but savage affair. The Dothraki overwhelmed the outriders, but not without losses. The Westerosi crossbows took a grim toll on the lightly armored horse lords. Daenerys felt a pang of grief when she heard of the casualties. The knowledge that these were the first of many weighed on her like a cold stone. In King's Landing, Robert Baratheon chafed under the counsel of his lords. Eddard Stark had arrived, urging caution, but also ready to fight to defend the kingdom. Tywin Lannister was rumored to be marching from the west with a large host. Stannis Baratheon commanded the royal fleet in an attempt to keep the Dothraki from receiving reinforcements or supplies by sea. Renly busied himself with diplomacy, trying to rally more houses to the crown. Cersei Lannister watched with quiet calculation, while Joffrey, still a boy, sneered at talk of the foreign whoreson queen. Robert was restless. He wanted to go north himself and lead the vanguard. He wanted to wrap his warhammer in Targaryen blood again. But many argued that the king should remain in the capital until the threat was fully understood. The memory of the Mad King's cruelty still burned brightly. They whispered that the princess might be just as dangerous. Or perhaps she was merely a figurehead, and the true danger lay in the thousands upon thousands of Dothraki riders. Eventually, Robert's impatience prevailed. He mounted his warhorse, took the main bulk of the king's armies, and marched north out of King's Landing. Ned Stark rode beside him, grim-faced, but loyal. They met up with other lords, forging an army that numbered in the tens of thousands. Heavy cavalry, archers, foot soldiers. A formidable force easily outnumbering Daenerys' Dothraki. Yet the horse lords commanded speed and ferocity that the Westerosi had seldom encountered. As the two armies drew near each other, the lands between them became a scorched wasteland. The Dothraki, in typical style, set fire to fields, razed villages, and generally tried to deny supplies to their enemies. This inflamed Robert's rage. He pressed forward for a decisive confrontation. Daenerys' scouts reported that Robert himself was with the enemy host, that the stag banners flew under a crowned presence. She called a council of her own, Drogo, Yora, the Blood Riders, and a handful of the elder Dothraki who advised her. They gathered in a conquered feast hall, the walls bare, torches flickering. Drogo stood behind Daenerys' seat while she listened to the council. "Your Grace," Yora said, pointing to a rough map of the area. "If we engage them on open ground, we stand the best chance. The Dothraki can strike from multiple angles, sowing confusion. We must avoid letting their lines close around us." Drogo nodded, indicating he had no intention of letting the Westerosi encircle them. The Dothraki were masters of lightning raids, not pitched battles where armies slammed into each other in neat formations. Daenerys leaned over the map. "But do we have enough riders to break their lines? Their archers could cut us down if we cannot flank them effectively. They cannot be strong on every side at once," Yora reminded her. "If we force them to spread out, we can find a weak point." She touched the spot on the map where the king's forces were believed to be camped, near a small tributary of the Blackwater Rush. "We should strike soon," she said softly, "before more lords join him." Drogo let out a decisive grunt. "Then we ride at dawn." It was not a restful night. Daenerys paced the halls, her footsteps echoing on the stone floors. She felt the child move, and she found herself murmuring lullabies in Valyrian. She prayed to the warrior to grant her strength. She touched the dragon eggs, yearning for the old magic of her house, but felt only cold stone. Eventually, she found Drogo staring at the moon outside on a balcony. He turned at her approach, drawing her near. His presence gave her solace. She clung to him for a moment, resting her head on his broad chest. "They think we are the invaders," she whispered, "but this is my home. I was born in the storms off Dragonstone. My family built the Red Keep. I have as much right to it as any living soul." Drogo's voice rumbled low. "Then show them tomorrow. Show them who you are." She nodded, heart pounding. When the sun's first light crept over the horizon, the khalasar mounted. Thousands of horses lined the fields. Daenerys joined them, clad in leather and light mail that Yora had helped her acquire. Her braided hair gleamed, and the 3 dragon eggs were strapped securely to her saddle in a special pack. She might not have dragons in flesh, but she carried their memory into battle. Drogo and his blood riders thundered at the forefront, their voices raised in war cries that made the air tremble. Robert's host was arrayed on the far side of a wide, sloping field near the banks of the tributary. She could see the stag banners in the distance, the sun glinting off metal helms and spears. Archers lined up behind the front ranks. Cavalry squadrons waited on the wings. It was a sight that might humble even the boldest warlord. Daenerys steeled herself. This was the moment that would decide if her quest ended in victory or death. The Dothraki advanced, hoofs thundering, the air filled with the pounding heartbeat of thousands of horses. Dust rose in a billowing cloud behind them. Daenerys guided her mount alongside Drogo, a swirl of excitement and terror in her blood. She glanced at him, saw his fierce grin. He lived for this. Across the field, horns sounded. The Westerosi lines held steady. Their archers raised bows. Daenerys saw the flutter of the king's banner, a crowned stag on a field of gold. Then the arrow storm began. Black shafts hissed through the air, a deadly rain descending on the charging riders. Horses screamed, men toppled, but the Dothraki did not slow. They thundered onward, splitting into smaller wedges to reduce losses. More arrows fell, but now the distance was closing. Daenerys's mount nearly stumbled as an arrow caught it in the flank, but she urged it onward. She saw Robert's knights preparing to countercharge. The crash of cavalry against cavalry loomed, a collision of steel and flesh. The first wedge of Dothraki smashed into the lines of mounted knights. The difference in fighting styles was stark. The Dothraki twisted in their saddles, slashing at the knights' visors and unarmored joints, moving with fluid grace. The knights sought to break the charge with the weight of their horses and armor, hacking down with swords or crushing enemies beneath heavy hooves. Screams and neighs filled the air. Daenerys found herself in the thick of it. She had a curved Dothraki Yora had given her. She might not have Drogo's prowess, but she knew how to stay in the saddle. A knight came at her, sword raised high. She managed to parry, the clash of steel jarring her arm. She urged her horse to circle, swinging again. He caught the blow on his shield, but her follow-up slash nicked the horse's flank. The animal shrieked, rearing. The knight was thrown, landing heavily on his back, winded. Another Dothraki finished him with a spear. The chaos of battle swirled around her, disorienting. Smoke rose from burning grass, set aflame by some Dothraki carrying torches. Arrows whizzed by. Men shouted, horses screeched. She glimpsed Drogo in the distance, unstoppable, cutting down any who dared face him. She saw the royal banner bobbing as Robert himself, clad in gleaming plate and crowned helm, brandished a massive warhammer. He roared, smashing aside a Dothraki rider with a single blow. Another came at him, but he swung in a vicious arc that sent the rider sprawling. Ned Stark fought nearby, more controlled and measured than Robert, but no less deadly with his long sword. The Dothraki parted around them, searching for weaker prey. The Westerosi foot soldiers advanced in disciplined ranks, presenting spears to fend off cavalry. Daenerys realized that the Dothraki needed to keep moving, or they would be encircled. She shouted for them to ride around the flanks, keep the momentum. But her voice was lost in the din. Somewhere in the melee, she heard Yora's voice calling her name. Then a group of Baratheon bannermen charged her position. She froze momentarily, heart hammering, a rack clutched tight. They bore down on her, but then Drogo was there, bellowing a challenge, hacking them aside with savage blows. She felt relief flood her. They regrouped, a knot of Dothraki around her. The line was wavering, though. The Westerosi foot was better organized, preventing the Dothraki from fully enveloping them. Then the second wave of horse lords came charging down the field. Thousands more who had held back now surged forward. The combined force slammed into the left flank of the Baratheon lines. Screams, the clash of steel, the wet thud of weapons biting flesh. The Westerosi ranks buckled. Drogo urged his men to press the advantage. The line began to fold in on itself, spearmen trying to hold formation under the onslaught of screaming riders swirling around them. For a moment, Daenerys thought they might break the entire army. But Robert Baratheon rode into the thick of the fray, warhammer raised high. His presence steadied his men. Knights and bannermen rallied around his banner, forming a bulwark. Ned Stark swept in from another angle, calm authority evident in every stroke of his sword. The Westerosi discipline began to tell. The foot soldiers regrouped behind their shields, forming a bristling hedge of spears, driving back the Dothraki. The field became a roiling pit of violence. Drums and horns blared from both sides. Daenerys' horse was bleeding, but still she rode on, trying to stay close to Drogo. She felt tears burn at the corners of her eyes, though she was too consumed by battle to let them fall. The bodies of men and horses littered the ground. Vultures circled overhead, black specks against the sun. She saw that the Baratheon center was struggling, but their left flank had managed to stabilize. Drogo's blood riders, unstoppable though they seemed, could not break the heavy lines of knights and men-at-arms alone. Gradually, the fight tilted in the Dothraki's favor. Their speed and ferocity wore down the disciplined ranks. Fewer Westerosi knights remained mounted. Many had been cut down or had their horses killed under them. The archers in the rear were running low on arrows. Still, they fought on because Robert Baratheon was there, smashing foes aside, roaring for them to stand their ground. Daenerys looked upon him with mingled awe and hatred, imagining him as the slayer of her brother Rhaegar. She wondered if, in some corner of his mind, Robert saw not just Dothraki, but Targaryens everywhere, ghosts of a war long past. Drogo gave the signal. A group of riders swept around Robert's left flank, attacking from behind. The Westerosi lines wavered, confusion rippling through them. Daenerys realized this was the moment. If they could strike at the king personally and bring him down, the rest might break. She spurred her horse forward, adrenaline surging through her veins. She and Drogo and the Blood Riders drove into the knot of knights surrounding Robert's banner. Swords and arcs rang, sparks flying. Robert's personal guard fought desperately. Daenerys slashed at a knight's helm, denting it. Drogo cut down another. Robert himself turned, bringing his warhammer in a deadly arc toward Drogo. The call blocked with his arak, the impact nearly tearing the blade from his hands. Robert snarled, swinging again. Drogo ducked, leaning from his saddle. He struck upward, catching Robert's helm and sending it flying. Robert's face twisted in pain as the edge of the blade cut his temple. Blood streamed down his cheek. In that instant, Daenerys urged her horse forward to strike at the king's unprotected side. But a knight lunged in front of her, their swords clashing. She gasped as the knight's blade scraped her arm. She fought back, the clang of steel echoing in her ears. Drogo and Robert were locked in savage combat, exchanging furious blows. The swirl of the battle forced them apart momentarily. Then Robert turned, bellowing, and hammered aside another Dothraki who tried to strike him from behind. Drogo circled, waiting for an opening. Suddenly, a horn sounded from the Baratheon rear. At first, Daenerys did not understand. Then she saw the banners on the far side of the field, gold lions on a crimson field. House Lannister had arrived, their forces sweeping in to bolster the king's men. The Lannisters were known for their cavalry, and soon they joined the fray, crashing into the flank of the Dothraki that had begun to break through. The tide of battle shifted. Daenerys heard the shrill cries of wounded horses, saw her men start to falter. Drogo roared in anger, ordering a regroup. He turned back to find Robert, but the king had drawn away, rallying his men. The Lannister cavalry was fresh, their horses unwounded, their knights unexhausted. The Dothraki found themselves suddenly flanked. Drogo bellowed for retreat. Daenerys hesitated. She had come so far, yet in the face of reinforcements, the Dothraki risked total encirclement if they persisted. She turned her horse, ignoring the pain in her arm, and followed Drogo's lead. The Khalasar began to stream away from the field, reforming in the distance. The Westerosi made no immediate pursuit, wary of an ambush. The battlefield lay behind them, a charnel ground of the dead and dying. Daenerys' heart pounded as she reached the safety of her lines, the adrenaline wearing off. Pain flared in her arm and side. She pressed a hand to her womb, silently reassuring Rhaego. Yora galloped up, his face pale. Grace, are you hurt? She shook her head weakly, though she felt the sting of blood trickling down her arm. A scratch. I'll live. She stared back at the battlefield. She saw the black and white shapes of carrion birds descending. We nearly had him, she whispered, thinking of Robert. Drogo rode up, his expression thunderous. He is a strong foe, he admitted, but we are not defeated. Next time, we will not let him escape. Daenerys nodded, trying to still the shaking in her hands. It had been a near thing, a savage melee unlike any she had ever seen. Both sides had taken grievous losses. Now the realm would rally more strongly than ever against her. She wondered if she had made the right choice in crossing the sea so soon. But there was no turning back. The Dothraki were here, her child was nearly due. Retreat meant the death of her dream, the death of the Targaryen claim. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She would see this through or perish. There was no other path. That night, the Dothraki encamped a few miles away, tending their wounded, burying their dead. Drogo's mood was mercurial, pacing like a caged panther. The men gave him a wide berth, except his closest blood riders. Daenerys sat in a hastily erected tent. Her arm throbbed. Yora stitched the wound in silence. She closed her eyes, letting the waves of pain wash over her. The tent flap rustled. She looked up to see a Dothraki warrior approach, cradling something in his arms. One of her dragon eggs. It had somehow come loose in the chaos of battle. Her heart lurched. "This fell," the warrior said in halting common tongue. "I found it." He placed it gently beside her, then departed. Daenerys pressed a hand to the smooth shell, feeling relief. She glanced at the egg's surface and thought she saw the faintest flicker of warmth in its depths. Was it her imagination? She leaned back, exhaustion closing in. The day had been brutal. She was certain Robert's host would not remain idle. More battles lay ahead. She prayed for strength, for her unborn child, for the dream of a Targaryen restoration. As the night deepened, she could not sleep. She wandered the outskirts of the camp, where fires still burned, men chanting victory songs in the Dothraki tongue, even though it had been more a draw than a true victory. She thought of the war hammer that had killed her brother, felt the old hatred surge. She told herself she was no longer powerless. She had gained the loyalty of a mighty Khalasar, fought Robert to a standstill in her first real battle. Soon enough, she would face him again. She did not know how many more battles it would take. She did not know if she would survive them all, but the choice had been made. Days turned to weeks as both armies maneuvered across the Crownlands. The Lannisters sought to trap the Dothraki between their forces and Robert's. Tywin Lannister was a cunning general, but Drogo and Daenerys knew how to vanish across the rolling hills, striking small outposts, ensuring they were never cornered. This was not how wars were normally waged in Westeros. The Dothraki brought their own brand of lightning warfare. The realm shuddered under repeated strikes. Villages burned. Lords quavered. Yet the numbers began to tell. The Dothraki had lost many riders in the crossing and in the pitched battles. Supplies became an issue, especially for the horses. In a half-ruined tower they used as a temporary refuge, Daenerys conferred with Yora. "We cannot fight a prolonged war of attrition," he told her, voice tight with concern. "The kingdom will rally. More and more banners will come. We must find a decisive blow." She nodded, her expression set. She had gone past the point of no return. With winter approaching, foraging would only become harder. She had thought of forging alliances with certain houses, but none had come forward, too afraid of Robert's vengeance if the Targaryens lost. If they saw a decisive Targaryen victory, perhaps that would change. "We should try again," she said at last. "Strike at Robert. If we can break him, the realm will fracture and come to us." Yora's eyes flicked to her belly. She was far along now, the child's birth nearing. He didn't voice the fear they both felt, that giving birth on a battlefield, in the midst of a campaign, was fraught with danger. "Your Grace, you must be careful. You cannot expose yourself on the front lines again. The risk is too great." She exhaled. "If I hide behind my Khalasar, how am I any different from a timid pretender? My strength is what gives them faith in me." A subtle knock on the door drew their attention. A Dothraki scout entered, kneeling briefly. He spoke in rapid low Valyrian, which Daenerys had taken pains to learn, telling her that scouts had found an opportunity. Robert's main camp was just north of the Windwater River, somewhat isolated as Tywin Lannister's forces were a day's march away. They might have a chance to strike swiftly before the armies could join. Daenerys looked to Yora, who wore a grim expression. "We'd be gambling everything on this," he said. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the child stir. This was her destiny, was it not? She had not come all this way to be beaten back by the man who had stolen her father's throne. "We ride," she said softly. When Drogo received the news, his reaction was immediate. An exultant grin of a man who relished the thought of catching a formidable opponent off guard. The Dothraki mobilized that same evening, moving swiftly along woodland tracks known to their scouts, sidestepping any watchers. By dawn, they were in sight of Robert's camp. The king's men had not expected an attack so soon. The Dothraki poured through the perimeter guards like a tide of steel. Daenerys stayed near the rear at Yora's insistence, but she could still hear the clash of swords, the screams as men tumbled from their tents, half-armored, half-awake. It was chaos. The Dothraki set tents aflame, scattering the king's men. Yet Robert Baratheon was not one to be taken easily. He and his personal guard mounted a desperate defense, trying to buy time for the rest of the army to rally. He roared in fury as he emerged from his command tent, warhammer already in hand, his helm crooked. Daenerys saw him across the swirl of fighting. She felt her heart hammer in her chest. This was it, the moment. If they killed him here, the realm would be hers for the taking. If they failed, the Dothraki would likely be overwhelmed. Drogo and his blood riders flung themselves toward the king's guard. Steel rang on steel. Robert fought with savage strength, crushing a Dothraki skull with a single blow. The king's guard closed ranks, but they were outnumbered. The camp was in flames, the king's men disorganized. Daenerys urged her horse forward. Pain lanced through her belly. She gasped, clutching at the reins. For a moment, she feared the baby might be coming. She pushed the thought aside, focusing on the chaos. A swirl of smoke parted. Suddenly, Robert was there, warhammer swinging. He knocked Drogo off balance, the khal stumbling from his saddle. Drogo rolled and came up with a snarl, lunging at Robert with his arak. The king barely managed to parry, but the savage strength behind Drogo's blow made Robert's arm tremble. Daenerys saw an opening. She kicked her horse, riding forward to flank the king. But a swirl of knights moved in, blocking her path. Jorah, from behind, tried to fight through them. Drogo and Robert circled each other, exchanging furious blows. Smoke and screams pressed around them. Robert drew blood, smashing Drogo's arm with the edge of the hammer. Drogo bellowed in pain, but he did not falter. He launched a vicious slash at Robert's unprotected thigh. The king staggered, cursing. Blood splattered the grass. Daenerys's heart pounded. If Robert fell, it would be over. She tried to break past the knights again, but they fought fiercely, determined to protect their king to the last. Then Drogo lunged, driving Robert to one knee. The king's hammer fell from his grip. Drogo raised his arak high to finish him. Daenerys held her breath. In a last burst of defiance, Robert yanked a dagger from his belt and plunged it into Drogo's side. The khal let out a choked roar of pain. He stumbled back, the blade lodged deep. Blood poured from the wound. Robert tried to rise, but his wounded leg gave out. He collapsed, breathing raggedly. It was then that Daenerys saw the opportunity. She managed to slip through as one of the knights fell. She dismounted, ignoring Jorah's shouted warning, and rushed to where Drogo and Robert lay bleeding. Drogo looked up at her, eyes wide with pain. Robert glared, face twisted with rage and fear. "You?" The king spat. "You're." Daenerys snatched an abandoned sword from the grass. She stood over Robert Baratheon, the man who had taken her family's throne. He was helpless, though still dangerous if he got hold of a weapon. She felt an overwhelming rush of emotion. Hatred, triumph, pity, and fear all at once. He had killed her brother Rhaegar. He had hunted her family. But was she truly to be his executioner? Her hand trembled on the sword's hilt. Then she thought of Rhaegar, of the future she wanted for him, of the Iron Throne she had come so far to claim. In a swift, decisive motion, she thrust the blade into Robert's throat. His eyes widened. Blood poured out, soaking the grass. After a moment, the king of Westeros went still. The usurper lay dead at Daenerys Targaryen's feet. A hush seemed to fall over the immediate circle of combatants. Some of the king's guard cried out in rage or despair. One lunged at Daenerys, but Jorah intercepted him, burying a sword in the knight's back. The other Dothraki pressed in, finishing off the remaining foes. Beyond them, the camp was in turmoil, but word began to spread. The king was dead. Daenerys dropped the sword from her shaking hand and knelt by Drogo, who was coughing blood. The dagger wound in his side looked deep, the blood dark. She pressed her hands to it, trying to stem the flow. "Find a healer," she cried, voice cracking. Drogo's eyes met hers. He gripped her wrist. "You have your throne," he murmured, voice thick with pain. Tears slipped down her cheeks. "We have it," she told him, though she was not certain it was true. Yet if Robert was dead, the realm would be thrown into disarray. If she seized that moment to press her claim, it might all be hers. She looked around wildly. The Dothraki hovered, uncertain, awaiting her orders. Jorah knelt at her side, pressing cloth to Drogo's wound. "We need a maester," he said, glancing at Daenerys. "This is beyond my skill." She nodded, swallowing her grief. Even as the tears welled, she stood. "Find one," she commanded. She looked at the Dothraki around her. "Gather the prisoners. Let no more blood be spilled unnecessarily." She raised her voice. "Your call has slain the usurper, and I—" She paused, trembling, then forced calm into her tone. "I have ended him. Now the realm will come to know the true queen." A ragged cheer rose, tempered by the reality of the wounded scattered about. Daenerys turned to Drogo again, kneeling at his side, stroking his hair gently. She felt Rego move in her belly, a brutal reminder that life continued, that more battles remained. Drogo's eyes flickered. She whispered words of comfort to him, promising that he would see his son, that he would ride across the plains of Westeros as its true conqueror. In the days that followed, the news spread like wildfire across the Crownlands and beyond. Robert Baratheon was dead, killed in battle by Daenerys Targaryen and her Dothraki horde. In King's Landing, chaos reigned. Cersei insisted that Joffrey was the rightful king. Renly championed a claim of his own. Stannis, upon learning of his brother's death, declared himself the true heir. Tywin Lannister mobilized to protect his grandson Joffrey's interests. But Daenerys pressed forward, the unstoppable momentum of her victory behind her. She marched on King's Landing, the battered remnants of Robert's host scattering or falling back to fortify the city. The Lannisters might have attempted to hold her off, but the city was in panic at the idea of a Dothraki siege. Many gates were barred, some men deserted. Meanwhile, Eddard Stark and a portion of the northern levies, uncertain of what to do after Robert's death, found themselves adrift in a realm that no longer had a single clear ruler. Daenerys' triumph was not without cost. Khal Drogo's wound festered despite the best efforts of captured maesters. She rode at the head of the Khalasar, but every day, she saw Drogo weaken. She clung to hope, drawing on the determination that had carried her this far. She told herself that if she took King's Landing, she could command the best healers in the realm, that she could find a cure for him. She also told herself that this was the only path. The fate of her unborn son, of the Targaryen line, depended on her forging ahead with no mercy. Camps sprang up around the city as Daenerys approached. The Dothraki circled it like a great noose, cutting off supply lines. The Red Keep loomed on its high hill, the sprawl of King's Landing below, frightened small folk crowding behind the walls. The new widows and orphans prayed for deliverance. The city's garrison prepared for a siege, but morale was low. The memory of the sack of King's Landing by Tywin Lannister decades ago lingered. Many feared a repeat if the Dothraki entered in anger. Daenerys sent a demand to the city: open the gates, acknowledge her as queen, or face the consequences. Cersei Lannister, now acting regent for Joffrey, refused. She spat on the notion of surrendering to the foreign savage and her horde. She whipped the city into a frenzy of defiance, while Joffrey postured from the Iron Throne, calling Daenerys vile names. The Lannisters had additional forces, but Tywin was delayed, embroiled in conflicts in the Riverlands as some houses rose to declare support for Daenerys out of old Targaryen loyalties or simple opportunism. Renly fled south to gather support. Stannis remained on Dragonstone, waiting. Eddard Stark, torn by honor, was rumored to be in the city, urging restraint, but overshadowed by the Lannisters. And so the siege began. Daenerys' pregnant form became a rallying symbol for the Dothraki, who saw her as the living embodiment of the Khal's strength. She would often ride along the walls, letting the city see her silver hair, letting them know that she was Aegon's blood returned. She recalled tales of Aegon the Conqueror taking King's Landing by dragonfire. She had no dragons to unleash, but she possessed an unyielding determination that surprised many. The city endured hunger and fear. Some began to clamor for surrender. Within the Red Keep, Cersei grew desperate. Whispers flew of attempts to assassinate Daenerys or to bribe her riders. The Queen Regent also tried to incite the Gold Cloaks to hold to Joffrey's cause. Eddard Stark, from his position, attempted to broker a peaceful transition, but he was outmaneuvered by Cersei and the Lannisters, who threatened to harm Sansa Stark if Ned betrayed them. The capital teetered on the edge of anarchy. One stormy night, Daenerys awoke to searing pain in her belly. She screamed, the sound echoing through the command tent. Yora rushed in, as did a Dothraki midwife. The baby was coming early. Lightning lit the sky, thunder roared, and the wind battered the tent. Drogo, despite his fever and weakened state, forced himself up, staggering to her side. Outside, the Dothraki muttered about omens and portents. Inside, Daenerys was consumed by agony. She felt as if she were split in two, the child raging to be born in the midst of a raging storm. The birth was long and grueling. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware at times of Yora's hand on her arm, of the midwife's frantic chanting, of Drogo's labored breathing. The wind howled, ripping at the tent. The dragon eggs lay by her side, heating inexplicably as if absorbing the storm's energy. In the end, she gave one final, primal scream, and the child slipped free of her body. She heard him wail, a strong cry that cut through the thunder. Then darkness claimed her. When she awoke, the storm had passed. The air felt charged, electric. Yora hovered nearby, relief flooding his features when he saw her open her eyes. The midwife placed a bundle in her arms. A baby boy, his skin flushed red, a tuft of silver-black hair on his head. He looked strong, already fussing. Daenerys cradled him, tears of exhaustion and joy mingling on her cheeks. "Rhaego," she whispered, remembering the name she had chosen. "My son." Nearby, Drogo lay weak and pale. He smiled faintly at the sight of his child, but Daenerys saw how the wound had drained him. She felt a hollow pit open in her stomach. This was supposed to be their triumph together. Now he hovered at the brink of death. A hush fell as the baby's cries died down. Then came a strange sound, a faint cracking, like stones grinding. Daenerys looked at the dragon eggs. They were hot, almost glowing in the dim lamplight. She stared in disbelief. Tiny fissures appeared in the shell of the green egg. Then a sliver of eggshell fell away, and a tiny claw emerged. Gasps rang out in the tent. Yora's eyes went wide. The Dothraki murmured prayers. She watched, transfixed, as the hatchling dragon broke free, writhing and squeaking in the cool air. Her heart thundered as she beheld a living dragon for the first time in centuries. Next, the black egg cracked, and then the cream and gold one. 3 dragons, small and fragile but undeniably alive, hatched under her gaze. They emitted tiny cries, wings flapping weakly. She knew instantly that this was the reason for her entire journey. It was not just for a throne, it was for the return of House Targaryen's true power. She wept, clutching her child, and those in the tent knelt before her. Even the midwife fell to her knees, proclaiming her the mother of dragons. But as a fierce joy swelled in Daenerys, she turned to see Drogo's eyes close, his breath rattle in his throat. "No," she breathed, handing the baby to Yora and crawling to Drogo's side. She took his hand, felt the life slipping away. "Drogo," she pleaded, tears running down her face. The new-hatched dragon squeaked, crawling unsteadily toward her. Drogo opened his eyes one last time, looked upon her and his son, and then exhaled. He was gone. She pressed her forehead to his, sobbing. The tent was silent except for the crackling of a small fire and the faint cries of the dragons. Outside, the Dothraki sensed the passing of their call. Some began to keen in mourning, while others felt confusion. They had followed Drogo. Now he was dead, and his Khaleesi had given birth to a child and 3 dragons. The entire Khalasar trembled at the shift. When dawn broke over the plains around King's Landing, Daenerys emerged from the tent. She was pale with grief but possessed a regal bearing that seemed almost inhuman. She carried the newborn dragons on her arms and shoulders, the tiny creatures clinging to her. Her child, Rhaego, was swaddled on her back, sleeping after his ordeal. The Dothraki stared, enthralled, fearful, uncertain. Drogo's body was prepared for a funeral pyre. She ordered it built high outside the city walls, where the defenders of King's Landing could see. That evening, as dusk fell, the pyre was lit. The flames roared into the sky. The Dothraki surrounded it in a solemn ring. Daenerys stepped forward, tears glistening on her cheeks. Dragons huddled close. She placed the dragon eggs shards into the fire to burn with Drogo, to signify that from his strength, from his sacrifice, House Targaryen, and had been reborn. She lowered her head in grief and whispered a final farewell to the man who had given her the confidence and child that would shape her destiny. But a new dawn waited. With Robert Baratheon dead, the realm fractured into competing claims. Joffrey, Stannis, and Renly each seized a piece of Baratheon power. The Lannisters, the Tyrells, the Martells all moved cautiously. Many houses recalled the old Targaryen days, some with fondness, some with dread. And here, outside King's Landing, a widowed Khaleesi with dragons at her command and the greatest horde of Dothraki ever seen in Westeros stood ready to press her claim. The city cowered, uncertain whether to fight a new conqueror who had replaced Aegon's dragons with newly hatched ones. Daenerys Targaryen gazed upon the city's high walls. She felt sorrow twist inside her for Drogo, for all the bloodshed. But she also felt the stirring of hope. The child in her arms, the dragons perched on her shoulders. She had become something more than a claimant to the Iron Throne. She was the living embodiment of Targaryen fire reborn. She thought of the war she had begun before the realm could tear itself apart in the chaos of the Five Kings that never fully ignited as before. She did not know what the future held, but she could see a path forward. With a final, stealing breath, she raised her head. The flames of the pyre danced behind her, reflecting in her violet eyes. Drogo was gone, but a new call of calls, she herself in spirit, might lead the Dothraki to their destiny. She would claim the Iron Throne. She would forge alliances or break them as needed. She would see her son grow into the stallion who mounts the world or the prince that was promised, whatever the prophecy demanded. And when the time came for the final battles that loomed beyond the horizon, the battles against the ancient darkness stirring in the far north, she would face them as well, dragons at her side. For now, she turned to the silent watchers of her khalasar and raised her hand. The dragons squawked, spreading their leathery wings. The Dothraki bowed their heads. She felt the weight of command settle upon her, heavier than any crown. Perhaps she was not ready. Perhaps she never would be. But she would endure. She would survive. The night air carried the tang of smoke and embers, mingling with the distant scent of the sea. She stood there, letting it wash over her, letting herself feel every pulse of her heart, every stirring of the dragons. Then she walked away from the pyre, deeper into the camp. She had a kingdom to conquer, a city to take, a life to forge for her child. And in the Red Keep, beyond those walls, was a throne of cold iron that had once belonged to the line of Targaryen kings. It awaited her now, in both the eyes of her enemies and the hearts of her allies, for better or worse. She would sit upon it or she would die in the attempt. Tomorrow, the gates of King's Landing would open, or they would fall. One way or another, Daenerys Stormborn, blood of the dragon, would shape the future of the Seven Kingdoms before the War of the Five Kings could even truly begin. And thus the realm's fate, and the fate of all Westeros, turned on the storm winds of her coming, and the crimson glow of Dragonfire reborn. Daenerys Targaryen rose before dawn on the morning after Khal Drogo's funeral pyre, eyes swollen from a night of tears and a heart bruised by grief. The hush over the Dothraki camp felt unnatural, as if the entire host stood poised on the cusp of some colossal shift. A red glow stained the sky near the horizon, the lingering embers of Drogo's pyre, or perhaps the promise of sunrise. Her 3 newborn dragons clung to her shoulders and arms, their small claws pricking her skin through her thin linen sleeves. She felt their warmth as a constant presence, each tiny creature exhaling wisps of hot breath that tickled her neck. Rhaego, her son, lay asleep in a shallow wicker cradle lined with soft furs. He was as quiet as the dawn itself, his slumber untroubled by the tumult that threatened to engulf the world outside. Daenerys bent and brushed a kiss upon his brow. He was so tiny, an infant with a tuft of silvery black hair, eyes that had only just begun to open on this realm. She felt an overwhelming protectiveness surge through her, a swell of fierce love that mingled with her grief over Drogo's death. The two emotions tangled in her breast, leaving her both fragile and unbreakable. Outside the tent, murmuring voices drifted between the rows of horses and the circles of banked fires. She sensed unease among the Dothraki. They had come to Westeros for Drogo. They had followed their mighty call across the poison water. Now their call was gone. What remained was a Khaleesi, an infant child, and 3 strange lizard birds that hissed and squeaked at the sunrise. Some warriors would be tempted to break away under new calls, to carve out their own path. It fell upon Daenerys to hold them, to prove that she was worthy of their obedience. And in that endeavor, she had no illusions. Only boldness and strength would keep them. She stepped out, letting the tent flap swing shut behind her, and the first rays of sun struck her silver hair. The dragons squirmed on her shoulders, chittering at the brightness. All around her, Dothraki warriors halted what they were doing to stare. They fixed their eyes on the infant dragons, as if marveling that such creatures could exist. The air felt weighted with possibilities. Jorah Mormont, bleary-eyed from tending the wounded through the night, came forward to bow his head. "Your Grace," he said quietly, glancing with mingled awe and caution at the dragons. "They've grown since last night." He was right. They were not larger in any obvious sense, but they appeared more vibrant, more alive. Their colors stood out. One dark as midnight with red accents, one a greenish bronze with shimmering scales, the last one cream and gold that blinked wide, curious eyes at the world. Daenerys drew in a steadying breath. "They are hungry," she observed. "We must find food for them. Raw meat, Jorah, whatever you can spare. They will not feed on burnt scraps." He glanced at the meager supplies that remained in the camp. Each day the siege wore on would tax them further. The Dothraki had begun to forage and raid the outlying farms around King's Landing. But the city's own resources, too, were strapped. "I will see to it," he said. "They should feast, and so should you. I know you're in mourning, but you must stay strong." Daenerys lowered her gaze. The grief for Drogo pressed heavily upon her, but she forced herself not to appear weak. "I will eat," she promised. "First, gather the Blood Riders. We must speak to the Khalasar, explain what has happened and what is to come. We cannot linger in uncertainty." Jorah inclined his head and went to do her bidding. Daenerys stood there, letting the warmth of the rising sun envelop her. She closed her eyes. The world smelled of ashes from the pyre, mingled with the salty tang of the sea breeze that blew inland. When she opened them again, she saw Aggo, Rakaro, and Kotho, once Drogo's blood riders, approaching. They knelt before her tent, though she noticed the hesitation in their eyes. A blood rider's oath to a call was for life, and in losing their call, they had lost that binding tie. Yet she carried Drogo's son, and the dragons had shocked them into awe. "Blood of my blood," Daenerys greeted softly in Dothraki, though she was uncertain if she could rightly call them that. "Our call has joined the stars. A new path opens before us." Aggo, the elder among them, lifted his gaze. "We saw his pyre burn through the night. He was a great call." His voice was husky with sorrow. "Now you stand alone." She felt the weight of the moment. "I do not stand alone," she said, letting her voice carry. "I stand with the son of Khal Drogo, who will one day mount the world. And I stand with these." She lifted her arms slightly, allowing the dragons to hiss and show themselves. "We have crossed the poison water. We have slain the usurper of my father's throne. We stand outside the city my ancestors built." Her words drew a ring of onlookers. The Dothraki began to gather, men and women both, some still tending to the wounded horses, others half-armed. They listened in silence, shifting in place. The crackling torches guttered in the brightening daylight. Daenerys drew breath, feeling the morning wind brush past her. "We came for the Iron Throne," she said, allowing the common tongue to mix with the Dothraki words so Ser Jorah and any other Westerosi in the camp might understand. "I will not turn back now. Drogo would not have wished it. His blood flows in our son's veins, and all that he dreamed, I will make reality." but I cannot do it alone. Will you follow me, as you once followed him?" The hush stretched out so long that her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She could almost hear a quiet creaking noise from the camp, as if the entire host leaned forward to listen for the next word. At last, Ricardo spoke. "Drogo promised you the 7 kingdoms. You have shown no fear. You have hatched these dragons." He gestured to the small creatures perched on her shoulders. "I never believed such things were anything but stories." He dropped to one knee, pressing his forehead to the ground. "I will follow you, blood of my blood." Kotho hesitated for a fraction of a heartbeat, but the sight of the dragons seemed to tip him into acceptance. He knelt as well, repeating, "Blood of my blood." Ago followed, and so did many others. A murmur rippled through the throng, not exactly joyous, but reverent and charged with possibility. Daenerys allowed herself a tiny exhalation of relief. The Khalasar would remain whole, at least for now. They might test her strength in the days to come, but she had bought herself time. She beckoned them to rise, shifting the conversation to practicalities. "We are at the gates of this city. Their so-called King Joffrey squats on the throne that belongs to me. But I have no wish to bathe King's Landing in blood, nor do I wish to see the small folk starve." She could see the faint flicker of confusion in some eyes. The Dothraki were more accustomed to conquering by terror. She pressed on. "We will take the city, or they will surrender it. One or the other. In either case, the sun will set on the Lannisters' hold here." A ragged cheer rippled through the gathered warriors. Hunger for plunder was in their blood, but so too was the desire for final victory. Daenerys nodded, then turned to Yora, who waited at the edge. "Tell me of the city's defenses this morning," she said in the common tongue. "Your Grace, our scouts report that the gold cloaks remain manning the walls, though their discipline is questionable," Yora said with a faint grimace. "The Lannisters have knights stationed at each major gate. The Red Keep stands strong on Aegon's high hill. It's rumored that Queen Cersei has placed archers on the battlements and in the city sprawl below. Likely, they've begun stockpiling barrels of wildfire, if there is any left, ready to fling at us should we attack head-on." She grimaced. The thought of wildfire conjured images of green flame, the kind that had burned her father's enemies, and nearly the city itself, decades before. "We cannot afford to storm the walls blindly. The city is large, and our numbers are limited compared to the defenders. Should they try to set King's Landing ablaze around us, tens of thousands of innocent people could die." She let out a breath. "Have we had any word from Lord Stark?" She remembered hearing from Yora that Ned Stark was in the capital, perhaps forcibly kept there by Cersei and the Lannisters. Yora shook his head. "No direct word. A few ravens came from inside the city, but it's unclear if any were from him. The messages were either coded or too vague. We know only that the situation is tense. The small folk are terrified of your army. Cersei has been feeding them stories, calling you a foreign invader who will burn the city like your father tried to do. But apparently, there's also talk of your 3 dragons, and that rumor is fueling as much curiosity as fear." Daenerys listened, biting her lip. If Ned Stark had the upper hand, the city might already have surrendered. He likely can do little against the Lannisters so long as they hold his daughter Sansa captive, or threaten the rest of his family. She glanced back at Rhaego's cradle, uncomfortably aware of the parallels. "Perhaps it's time for a demonstration of my power that doesn't require raising King's Landing. We must show them that we can, and will, take the city, but also that we offer mercy if they bend the knee." She turned to her new blood riders. "We will approach the walls under a flag of truce. I will speak so that all can hear. After that, if the gates do not open, we will make our assault. But we'll do it in a way that spares as many small folk as possible. The Iron Throne is my birthright, but I do not want it stained with the blood of innocents." Her words invited uneasy shifting among the Dothraki. They understood conquest in simpler terms. Yet she saw that many had accepted her stance because she was Daenerys Stormborn, the woman who had hatched dragons and outlived a crossing of the sea. She nodded. "Prepare yourselves. We ride for the city within the hour." She left Yora to handle the details. For a moment, She retreated into her tent to check on Rigo. He slept soundly, oblivious to the tension outside. The dragons crowded around his cradle, as if curious about the new warm creature. She gently scooped them up, setting them back on their little cloth nest. "Not yet," she told them softly. "He's too small and you might scratch him." The largest one, the black dragon she had named Drogon in memory of Drogo, hissed quietly but did not resist her touch. She could feel the heat that radiated from its scales, as though its blood was molten. A swirl of fear and wonder churned inside her. Dragons, her house's ancestral strength. They were only hatchlings, so small and fragile right now. Yet one day, they might grow to cast shadows over entire cities. What would the Seven Kingdoms do then? She banished the thought and kissed Rigo's forehead. "I will come back for you," she promised him. "When I do, this city will be ours." Outside, the warhorses milled in restless groups. Dothraki braves rebraided their hair, polished their araks, checked their saddles. The tension coiled in the air like a drawn bowstring, ready to loose at any spark. Daenerys mounted the pale silver mare she had ridden since her wedding day. Her arm and side still ached from the recent battle where Robert Baratheon had fallen, but she forced herself to keep a regal bearing. She wore a simple leather vest dyed the color of midnight, black breeches, and boots suited for riding, not a queen's gown. Her hair she left partially unbound, the rest woven into a single braid with small silver rings. If these people expected to see a Targaryen queen of old in flowing silks, let them see instead a warrior woman who had fought for her crown. By her side rode Yora, grim-faced in partial plate. Behind them trailed a small retinue of Dothraki, each carrying an arak, a spear, or a curved bow. Ricardo bore the flag of truce, a strip of white cloth affixed to a slender pole. The rest of the Khalasar arrayed itself around the camp, ready to ride if negotiations went sour. As they approached the city walls, Daenerys heard distant horns sounding from within. King's Landing rose before her in a sprawl of stone and timber structures clustered beyond the high walls. The Red Keep perched on the highest hill like a sullen red fortress. Archers lined the ramparts, their fletching glinting in the early morning light. Gold cloaks watched warily, crossbows and spears at the ready. Daenerys guided her mare closer to the great city gate, solid oak reinforced with iron bands, a portcullis lowered behind it. The Lannister lion and the Baratheon stag still flew side by side above the gatehouse, but the stag's banner felt hollow now that Robert lay dead. She reined in perhaps 20 paces from the wall, her retinue fanning out behind her. Her heart hammered in her chest. She reminded herself that she faced the same fear when she walked into Drogo's funeral pyre. She had survived that. She had hatched dragons. She would survive this. "Bring me someone to speak with," she called, her voice echoing across the open ground. She spoke in the common tongue loud enough to carry. "I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, rightful queen of the Seven Kingdoms. I come under a flag of truce." She spurred her mare forward another few steps. One of the gold cloaks atop the ramparts shouted, "Stay back! We'll let you speak, but if you come closer, we'll loose arrows." Daenerys lifted her chin. "I do not fear your arrows, but I come to offer you terms. Will you hear them?" A stirring on the walkway preceded the arrival of a more finely clad guard captain, wearing a cloak trimmed with black fur. He peered down at her, his expression wary. "The hand of the king has said you'll receive no audience within these walls. The Queen Regent remains behind the Red Keep's walls." She guessed that meant Cersei refused to parley in person. "Coward. Then you can carry my words to them," Daenerys replied, letting her voice roll. "Tell them that I, Daenerys Targaryen, do not wish to harm the people of King's Landing. I only demand the throne that was stolen from my family. If the city opens its gates, I will offer mercy. Those who surrender may keep their lives, their homes. But if you do not open these gates, I will take the city by force. And when it falls, all who stood against me shall face the dragon's wrath." She paused, letting the phrase hang in the air. She had no desire to see King's Landing destroyed, yet it was crucial that she appear capable of doing just that. In the corner of her vision, she saw a handful of gold cloaks exchange uneasy glances. "You have no dragon's wrath," one jeered from a tower. "They say you carry lizards on your shoulders, not beasts of legend." She forced herself not to flinch. "They are young dragons," she answered coolly, "and even young dragons can burn. But do not think they are my only weapon. Your king is dead, and I have the largest Dothraki horde in living memory at my back. Ask yourselves if the Lannisters can save you. Ask yourselves if Joffrey can protect you." A mutter arose from within. The city gates remained closed, the portcullis down. The captain grimaced. "We have no authority to open the gates," he said in a more moderate tone. "Cersei Lannister is regent, and the boy on the throne is our king. She has commanded that we hold against you. She says you are come to burn the city." Daenerys studied him. He did not look like a man eager for a siege. She saw lines of worry etched into his face, the kind that told of sleepless nights. "Take my words to her. You have until sundown tomorrow to open your gates and proclaim me queen. If you refuse, or if any arrow is loosed at my men, I will bring war to these walls. No quarter will be given to those who resist." She tugged on the reins, turning her mare about. Her retinue followed suit. As they rode back, she felt the tension thrumming through her like a taut bow. She had set the terms. Now the city must decide. Would Cersei yield, or would she force a bloody siege? They returned to the lines of the Khalasar, where the rest of the Dothraki waited, watchful. Daenerys saw the flash of steel and the glint of the morning sun on horse armor. War drums waited to be beaten if it came to an assault. She pressed Dahan D lightly to her belly, still sore from giving birth, and prayed that she would not have to endure a slaughter. At the same time, she steeled herself to do what must be done if the Lannisters refused. Her father's madness had destroyed the realm. She would not be the same. She would not burn this city out of blind spite. She would give them a chance. But if they forced her hand, she dismounted, handing the reins to a waiting groom. The motion sent a twinge of pain through her side, where an old bruise lingered from the battle with Robert's host. Jorah dismounted as well, removing his gauntlets. "They will not yield so easily," he said quietly. "Cersei is proud, and she'll cling to any power she has left. She must be telling the small folk that you're a second coming of the Mad King." Daenerys's jaw tightened. "We'll see what happens when the gates stay shut and her people begin to starve. Or if the gold cloaks realize the Lannisters can't protect them." She looked to the city again, seeing the sun glint off the red roofs and the crooked spires. "I am prepared to wait until sundown tomorrow, but not longer. If I show weakness, the Dothraki may desert me, or Cersei might gather more allies." She thought of Tywin Lannister, a cunning warlord who might be marching from the west, or perhaps was delayed by skirmishes. And the Tyrells might send men, or the Martells. Though they had no love for the Lannisters, they had not openly declared for her. The realm was a chaos of claims now that Robert was dead. They settled in to wait. A full day passed with no movement from the city. Daenerys' stomach churned each time a new rumor reached her ears. That Cersei was rousing the population to fight in the streets, that Renly Baratheon was riding for the capital with a grand army, that Stannis had set sail from Dragonstone with a fleet. None were confirmed. She stayed near her tent to care for Rhaego and feed the dragons morsels of raw mutton. The dragons squeaked hungrily, snapping at the meat with needle-like teeth. Their eyes burned with uncanny intelligence, and they craned their necks to watch her every movement. Sometimes she thought they might be growing bigger already, though it could have been her imagination. On the second day, with the sun dipping low toward the horizon, Daenerys mounted again. She wanted to give the city one last chance before she ordered the assault. She and Jorah rode forth, though this time she did not bother bringing a large retinue. If the city was to open its gates and surrender, it would do so now or never. The watchmen on the walls must have seen them come, but no one hailed them. No movement. A cold dread settled in Daenerys' stomach. Cersei was refusing her terms. "Your Grace," Jorah murmured, halting his horse at her side. "They're not opening the gates." She tightened her hands on the reins. Then we must prepare for the assault at first light tomorrow. She heard the tremor in her own voice but let it pass. She would not cry before her men. We will storm the city, drive the gold cloaks back, and secure the gates. We must be mindful of traps, oil, wildfire, anything they can throw at us. Yora nodded. And what of the Red Keep? A flicker of memory stirred in her mind, of stories describing Aerys Targaryen's final days, the barrels of wildfire that had been hidden around the city. Not all had been found, if the rumors were true. One step at a time, Ser Yora, she said quietly. Once we open the gates, we'll move up the city in force. The Red Keep might resist, but it will fall eventually. She recalled that she had promised mercy. Order the men, no wanton slaughter. They may take plunder if the foe resists, but no killing of the innocent, no rapes, no burning. They break my command, they die. He dipped his head. I will do what I can to enforce it. They turned back, the city still silent behind them, lit by the fiery reds and oranges of the setting sun. In that moment, it looked almost serene, as though it were just another city by the water. She felt a surge of regret for the blood that would spill. But the Lannisters had forced her hand, refusing to yield. If the siege dragged on, more innocents would starve or suffer. A swift and decisive blow might end it quickly, even if it carried its own cost. She barely slept that night. Rhaego fussed in her arms, sensing her tension perhaps. She nursed him in the quiet darkness, feeling tears threaten at the corners of her eyes. The dragons, curled near the brazier, shifted restlessly, as if the violence to come made them uneasy. Her mind drifted to Drogo, to his warm laugh and the way he would stroke her hair as she fell asleep in his arms. He had been a conqueror, ruthless, but with her, he had shared a tenderness that few believed possible. She felt his absence keenly, like a missing limb. I hope I am doing this right, she whispered, hugging Rhaego close. I hope you would be proud of me. The dawn came in a blaze of color across the sky. The Dothraki had already assembled for the assault. Horsemen formed up in loose ranks, each with a curved bow or an arak. A group of them had makeshift ladders and hooks to scale the walls if the gates refused to budge. Others carried oil-soaked rags and torches for intimidation, though Daenerys had forbidden setting the city ablaze except as a last resort. At the forefront stood a knot of blood riders, among them Ricardo, who had proven fiercely loyal in recent days. Their horses snorted and stamped, eager for the charge. Daenerys donned her leathers again, her hair pulled back in a single silver braid. She tried to keep her face calm, though her pulse raced. She could hardly believe she was about to order a direct assault on King's Landing, an act that might reverberate for centuries. She thought of Aegon the Conqueror, who had taken Westeros with dragons by his side. Her own dragons were too small to carry her into battle, so she left them behind with a cadre of guards in the camp. They shrieked in protest, flapping tiny wings, as if sensing her departure. She steeled herself. One day, she thought, they might be the key to an unbloodied victory. But not now. She swung into the saddle, ignoring the twinge in her side. Ser Yora rode beside her on a warhorse borrowed from the Dothraki, wearing a mix of plate and boiled leather. He lowered his visor, his expression grim through the gap. Your Grace, we await your word. She let her gaze wander over the host. Tens of thousands of Dothraki, parted from their distant homeland, now on the brink of smashing the walls of the greatest city in Westeros. It was enough to take her breath away. She raised her hand. We take the gate, she said, letting her voice carry. No mercy for those who resist, but do not harm those who surrender or flee. Fight with honor. Now ride, for Drogo, for our son, for the blood of the dragon. A roar erupted from the Dothraki. Drums began a pulsing beat, and the hooves thundered as the first wave charged forward. The morning sun caught the steel of their weapons, flashing like shards of lightning. Daenerys urged her mare into a gallop, riding at the forefront of the center. Yora and a knot of blood riders surrounded her as a protective guard. The wind whipped her hair back, and her heart hammered. She clung to that primal sense of freedom that came from galloping into battle, all her fears drowned out by the pounding of hooves and the furious roar of the Dothraki war cries. Ahead, the city walls loomed. Archers stood ready on the ramparts, crossbows aimed. Daenerys braced herself. A moment later, a storm of arrows whistled down. The front ranks of Dothraki parted, some horses screaming and collapsing as they were struck. Men tumbled, rolling in the dust, but the rest surged on. Return fire came from the Dothraki archers, arrows loosed from horseback in a fluid motion. Some defenders toppled from the walls. Others hunkered behind merlins. Daenerys spotted a group of gold cloaks manning a ballista near the gatehouse, trying to aim at the mass of riders. But the Dothraki did not charge in a single tight wedge. They fanned out, swirling, making the siege engine struggle to find clear targets. Jorah raised his shield to block a stray arrow. Daenerys flattened herself against her horse's neck as more shafts rained down. She felt one tear through the air inches from her cheek. The adrenaline surged in her veins. The outer gate was a huge wooden construct bound with iron. A portcullis stood behind it. The Dothraki brought forward their rams, rough, hastily made but solid, each carried by a dozen men. They crashed the first ram against the gate, a deep reverberating boom. The defenders above poured boiling oil over the sides. Screams erupted as the scorching liquid rained down on some unfortunate Dothraki. The acrid stench of burnt flesh stung Daenerys' nostrils. She clenched her jaw. This was the reality of taking a city. No illusions. "Another ram!" she shouted, spurring her horse to the side to avoid the splatter of oil. Ricardo gestured, and more men rushed up with a second battering ram. Arrows fell in a deadly shower, but the Dothraki pressed in, determined to break the gate. Daenerys ducked behind her horse's neck as a crossbow bolt thudded into the ground. The assault drummed on boom, boom, boom. The city gate shuddered beneath the repeated impact. If it did not give soon, many more lives would be lost in this attempt. A great crack sounded. The Dothraki roared in triumph as the upper beam of the gate splintered. Immediately, gold cloaks on the other side wedged timbers and barrels to reinforce it. Daenerys saw the gap forming near the hinge. She called out in Dothraki, "Push! Break it now!" Men hammered again, the wedge groaning. A final blow snapped the hinge, and the battered gate listed inward. The Dothraki screamed victory, surging ahead. The portcullis behind remained a barrier, but a narrower one. Archers on the walls tried to pick off the men near the gap. Jorah guided his horse closer. "We need to lift that portcullis or smash it too," he shouted above the din. Daenerys scanned the gatehouse. "Is there a mechanism inside?" Typically, portcullises were raised by a winch accessible via the gatehouse above. That meant someone had to get inside and operate it or break it. Ricardo slid from his horse, handing the reins to a companion. "I go," he said. He pointed to a cluster of Dothraki. "We climb. We kill. Then the gate is open." "Be careful," Daenerys said. He gave her a quick, fierce grin, and then he and his chosen men rushed forward, hooking ropes over the battlements to scale the wall. The defenders jabbed spears downward, trying to repel the climbers. Screams rang out. Some Dothraki tumbled to their deaths, but Ricardo pressed on, agile as a cat. Daenerys glimpsed him at the top, vanishing over the parapet in a swirl of dust. Moments later, she heard shouts from within. More arrows zipped overhead. A gold cloak fell from the battlements, arms flailing, and landed with a sickening crunch at the base of the wall. Daenerys shielded her eyes against the sun, straining to see Ricardo's progress. Then came a screech of chains, a deep groan of metal. The portcullis began to rise, slowly at first, then picking up speed. "Charge!" Daenerys commanded, heart racing. The Dothraki seized the chance, rushing through the ruined gate. The defenders inside struggled to hold them back, but the swirl of mounted riders in the courtyard was too swift. Daenerys cantered through as well, Jorah at her side, ducking to avoid a crossbow bolt. A wave of chaos enveloped them. Narrow streets, the clang of steel, the cries of frightened small folk who darted for cover. Inside the walls, King's Landing was a maze of twisting alleys, ramshackle houses leaning precariously overhead. The Dothraki fanned out in multiple directions, some seeking to secure the gatehouse from above, others galloping into the main thoroughfare that led toward the Red Keep. Daenerys forced herself to focus. They had to maintain some order, or risk becoming entangled in brutal street-by-street fighting. She beckoned to Yora. "Hold the gate, keep a path open, let the main host in. Then we'll press toward the Red Keep." She locked eyes with him. "Remember, no killing the innocent." He nodded, though he wore a pained expression. "I'll do my best, but it's going to be bloody in these streets. Some among the Khalasar will want to pillage." Daenerys fought down a wave of revulsion. "Punish any who violate my order." She leaned close, dropping her voice. "We must not make enemies of the small folk. We need them. They need us." He reined away, issuing commands in rough Dothraki. Daenerys could not linger. She spurred her mare along a cobbled lane that curved toward the city's heart, accompanied by a dozen riders. They galloped past shuttered shops and frightened onlookers. Occasionally, a gold cloak or a band of Lannister men-at-arms would try to bar their path, but the Dothraki cut them down with swift, whirling strikes. Bodies spilled into the gutters, blood swirling in rivulets. Daenerys clenched her teeth, determined not to let her horror paralyze her. Ahead, she glimpsed a larger square, overshadowed by the September of Baelor's tall pillars in the distance. Shouts echoed from that direction. She realized some of the City Watch had formed a defensive line there, perhaps rallying under the statue of some past king. The Dothraki slammed into them from the flank. Steel clashed. Daenerys slowed, scanning the chaos. The Watch seemed uncertain, lacking strong leadership or a will to fight. They had pinned their hopes on the walls, and the walls had been breached. One watchman, seeing her, threw down his spear and fell to his knees. She heard him cry out, "Mercy! Mercy!" in a cracked voice. She drew rein, adrenaline still surging. "Then yield," she called. "Yield, and you will live." The watchman nodded frantically, tossing aside his shield. A few others did the same, stepping back with hands raised. The Dothraki were not used to such surrender, so Daenerys shouted, "Do not kill those who yield." Her men hesitated, but she repeated the order. Gradually, the watchmen were disarmed, forced to kneel. Daenerys dismounted, striding among them. "If you obey me, you live. If you resist, you die. Spread the word." The watchmen nodded, trembling. Some had fear in their eyes, others relief at not being murdered outright. Daenerys turned to one near the front, a grizzled man with a rent in his cloak. "Where is the hand of the king?" she demanded. "Eddard Stark. Is he still in the Red Keep?" I believe so," the watchman stammered. "They say he's a prisoner. The queen keeps him close, or else locked away in the dungeons." Daenerys's throat tightened. She thought of how different all this might have been if Ned Stark had taken some measure of control in King's Landing. Perhaps the city would have surrendered peacefully. She needed him free. "Then take me to the Red Keep," she commanded. "We go at once." The man swallowed. "It's heavily guarded, my lady. The Lannisters are sure to have men in the streets leading up to it. It's a fortress." Daenerys's expression hardened. "I have an army. Show me the way." She swung back onto her horse, gesturing for the watchman to come along on foot. He scrambled to comply, leading her and her riders toward the main route up Aegon's high hill. More Dothraki forces streamed through the narrow streets now, clashing with gold cloaks or Lannister men along the way, but the city guard was crumbling in discipline. Some sections fought back fiercely, while others threw down arms at the sight of the charging horse lords. As they ascended the winding approach to the Red Keep, Daenerys glimpsed the wide, squat shape of the castle's outer walls. The gates there were shut, murder holes above. The castle perched high, dominating the city, a vantage from which archers could rain death. But she saw fewer archers than she had feared. The Lannisters might have drawn them down into the city to defend the gates. "Do they have wildfire stored?" she asked Yora. who rejoined her with a small group of reinforcements. Possibly, he said. If they do, they haven't used it yet. Perhaps they meant to save it for a last stand. A last stand it shall be, then, Daenerys murmured. She guided her horse to a vantage point behind a half-collapsed stable that overlooked the castle gates. We'll need a battering ram to break those gates, or perhaps a cunning approach. Alternatively, if Ricardo can scale the walls again. Her words cut off as a commotion stirred on the ramparts. She saw Lannister guards scurrying, and the gates of the Red Keep creaked open from within. A single horseman emerged, bearing a white flag. Daenerys stiffened. A second parley? She signaled her men to hold. The horseman trotted out into the courtyard space before the castle gate. He wore a gold and crimson tabard, the Lannister lion emblazoned proudly. "Halt!" called Jorah, lifting a hand. The man obediently reined in. "I come from Queen Regent Cersei Lannister," he declared, though Daenerys heard the tremor in his voice. "She invites the Targaryen queen to treat within the throne room, on neutral ground." A wave of wariness swept through Daenerys. Cersei Lannister was many things: cunning, ruthless, manipulative. An invitation to a parley in the throne room might be a trap. "On what terms?" she called, her voice echoing. "The Queen Regent states that she will hear your demands for the city's fate if you come in good faith, unarmed," the herald said, eyes flicking nervously to the Dothraki. "She asks that you bring only a small escort. She offers her personal guarantee of safety during the meeting." Daenerys gave a cold laugh. Her personal guarantee? She remembered how that guarantee meant nothing if cunning was at play. She glanced at Jorah, who shook his head slightly. "It could be a ploy," he murmured. "But if you refuse outright, we might have to storm the Red Keep, which will be costly. Or the Lannisters might burn the entire place with wildfire out of spite." Daenerys's heart pounded. She considered her next words carefully. "Tell Queen Cersei that I accept her invitation on one condition. She will allow Lord Eddard Stark to join this meeting, alive and unharmed, or I will leave and resume the attack. I also require that I be permitted an armed escort of at least 4 of my own men. My blood riders do not go unarmed." The herald shifted in his saddle. I will convey your terms. Wait here." He wheeled about, returning into the Red Keep. The gates groaned shut behind him, leaving Daenerys and her men in tense silence. She felt Jorah's concerned gaze. "You mean to go, then? If they allow Ned Stark to appear, it suggests at least some measure of sincerity. If they refuse, we break down these gates," Daenerys said in a low tone. "We can ill afford a long siege, and more blood will be spilled for every moment we delay. If I can force Cersei to see sense, or even if I can simply remove her from power quickly, it might spare the city more suffering." Jorah nodded, though a flicker of anxiety remained in his eyes. "Then I will stand at your side, armed." A hush fell as they waited. The city behind them was largely subdued, though sporadic fighting still flared in pockets. Smoke drifted up from a few fires where buildings had caught flame. Daenerys felt each passing moment as a weight on her soul. She thought of Rhaego in the camp. She thought of her newly hatched dragons. Could she truly entrust herself to the mercy of Cersei Lannister, even for a moment? At last, the gates opened again, and the same herald rode forth, accompanied by 2 more horsemen in Lannister Sea. "Ollers, your condition is accepted," he announced, though Daenerys detected a certain reluctance in his tone. "Lord Stark will be brought to the throne room. The Queen Regent requests that you come now, with no more than 4 guards. The rest must wait outside the gates." Daenerys took a breath. "Very well." She turned to her men. "Aggo, Jorah, Kotho, and Ricardo is still at the gatehouse. Find him. These 4 will be my escort. You may attempt no treachery, or the city will burn. And if any harm comes to me or my guards, my Khalasar will exact a terrible vengeance." She paused. "Make that clear." The herald bobbed his head nervously, repeating her words for the guards behind him. Meanwhile, Ricardo was summoned from his command near the city gate, slightly bloodied but triumphant. He came at once, eyes bright. Daenerys dismounted, choosing to enter the Red Keep on foot. Yora and the 3 Dothraki escorted her, each wearing curved blades at their hips. A hush settled as they passed through the open gate into the courtyard. Lannister soldiers stood to either side, crossbows half lowered, eyes flicking with equal parts fear and hatred. Daenerys' heart pounded, but she kept her spine straight, her chin high. The Queen Regent had attempted intimidation once before. Daenerys refused to cower. They were led through a winding corridor of stone arches, up a short flight of steps, and into the great hall of the Red Keep. The high, vaulted ceiling soared overhead. Sunlight slanted through narrow windows, illuminating columns of dust motes. At the far end stood the Iron Throne, a hulking mass of twisted swords, said to have been forged by the breath of Aegon's dragons. Daenerys had dreamed of it all her life. Now, seeing it in person for the first time, she felt an eerie hush settle over her spirit. This was the seat her ancestors had once claimed. The seat her father had corrupted with madness and cruelty. The seat Robert Baratheon had usurped. And she had come all this way with blood and sacrifice to reclaim it. Beneath the throne, on the first step, sat Joffrey Baratheon, thin-limbed, a golden crown perched on his blonde hair. He looked younger than she expected, hardly more than a boy, yet his pale eyes gleamed with malice. To his left stood Cersei Lannister, robed in crimson and gold, her green eyes watching Daenerys with open contempt. On the other side, flanking the throne, were several Kingsguard in white cloaks, swords at their hips. Daenerys recognized Ser Meryn Trant from descriptions she had heard. Further along, guards in Lannister livery ringed the hall. But the sight that truly tugged at Daenerys was Eddard Stark, standing in the center of the throne room, a manacle on one wrist, bruises on his face. He wore simple garments, stained with old blood. His hair was more gray than brown, and the lines of care on his face were deeper than she remembered from any stories. He raised his head when she entered, eyes registering surprise, then relief, then wariness. He did not smile. This was not a triumphant man, but the fact that he still stood told her that the Lannisters had not broken him entirely. Silence reigned as Daenerys crossed the expanse of the throne room, Yora and the 3 Dothraki at her back. She met Joffrey's gaze briefly before turning to Cersei. "I was told Lord Stark would be unharmed," she said icily, noting the bruises. Cersei inclined her head, a false gesture of politeness. "He is alive as promised. That will have to suffice." Joffrey fidgeted on the step below the Iron Throne, fiddling with the hilt of a small sword. "You think you can waltz in here, call yourself queen, and we will simply kneel?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth. "I am the king. This is my throne. You're nothing but a usurper's spawn." Daenerys arched an eyebrow. "You are no king," she said quietly. "Your father is dead, slain by my Khalasar. You hold the throne by force alone. But your force has crumbled. My army is at your gates. I have taken the city but for this castle. Your men die in the streets even as we speak. You are beaten." Joffrey's face twisted in rage. He opened his mouth to retort, but Cersei laid a hand on his arm. She turned her attention to Daenerys. "The city is not yet entirely yours," she said in a measured tone. "We still hold the Red Keep. We still have resources you cannot imagine. If you believe this is decided, you are a fool." Daenerys did not waver. "I gave you a chance to surrender the city, and you refused. Now your walls have fallen, your men are thrown into chaos. Hundreds lie dead already. How many more must perish before you yield?" Cersei's green eyes flickered with something like hatred. "Have you come here to demand my surrender?" Daenerys took a single step forward. Her blood riders tensed behind her, hands on their blades. The Kingsguard similarly shifted, each placing a hand on the hilt of his sword. She glanced at Ned Stark, who watched in silence, shoulders rigid. "Release Lord Stark and renounce your claim to the Iron Throne," Daenerys said, letting her voice carry. "Yield the city to me, declare me the rightful queen, and I will allow you and your children to leave unharmed. You may go to Casterly Rock, or anywhere beyond the city's walls. If you do not, I will take your heads, just as I took Robert's." Ned Stark's brows rose at her words, and she sensed a shock ripple through the hall. She had not meant to be so blunt, but the moment demanded it. Joffrey snarled, half rising. "You dare! I will have your head." Cersei pressed him back down, whispering something. Then she smiled at Daenerys, the smile of a cornered lioness. "You speak as if we have no options, Targaryen. You forget that my brother, Lord Tywin Lannister, marches from the west with a host that will tear your savages apart. Or perhaps Renly Baratheon will arrive. Did you not consider that Robert's brothers would not stand idly by while you take the throne?" Daenerys remained unmoved. "They may come. By the time they reach the city, I will already sit the Iron Throne. And if you truly believe your father can save you, you might recall that we bested Robert Baratheon and the combined might of the Crownlands in open battle. My Dothraki do not fear any army of the West." Joffrey hissed a curse. "Mother, let us kill her now. We have archers enough to fill her with arrows." At that, Daenerys felt a prickle of danger. She knew she stood in the lion's den. If an arrow were loosed, she might die in seconds. But she lifted her chin, calling Joffrey's bluff. "Try it," she said softly. "My men will cut you down, and your mother, and everyone in this keep. I promise your heads will dangle from the city gates by nightfall, and your small folk will cheer that the cruelty of House Lannister has ended." Cersei's lips parted in anger, but she controlled herself with a visible effort. "You speak of cruelty? Child, you have unleashed savage horse lords upon this city." Daenerys's voice rose. "I have come home to claim what is mine. I do not wish unnecessary bloodshed. Surrender and I will show mercy. Continue this charade, and I will tear down the Red Keep if I must." She let her gaze flick toward Ned Stark. "Lord Stark, do you wish to serve your rightful queen? Or do you stand with these Lannisters who murdered your king and imprisoned you?" Ned Stark lifted his head. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "I stand for the good of the realm," he said. "I have no love for the Lannisters, nor any desire to see innocent blood spilled. Your Grace, if you are queen by right, show it now by tempering your wrath with justice." He was a proud man, but she heard something else in his tone. Caution, entreaty, perhaps a recognition that her success might be the only way to prevent further slaughter. He believed Robert's cause had been misguided, or that the realm needed new leadership. Daenerys clasped her hands in front of her. "I will, but I must first remove the Lannisters from power. Stand with me, Lord Stark." He paused, glancing at Cersei, whose face was carved in fury. Then he nodded. "I will stand for justice, if you will have me, your Grace." She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "I will." Turning to Cersei, she spread her hands. "So you see, your cause is lost. Lord Stark was your prisoner. Now he will be my hand, if he desires that position." She saw Ned Stark's eyes widen slightly at the suggestion, but he did not protest. "Now, kneel, or the next time I speak, it will be to order my men inside." A hush blanketed the throne room. She heard Joffrey's ragged breathing, saw his eyes dart to the doors, as if considering flight. Cersei slowly stood, her posture rigid, her face a mask of fury. "You leave me no choice," she said in a voice tight with hatred. "The city is lost, and I will not let my son die here." She turned to Joffrey, forcibly pulling him up. "Kneel," she commanded him through clenched teeth. Joffrey resisted for a moment, petulance twisting his features. Then he gave Daenerys a look of pure loathing and sank to one knee. "The throne is yours," he spat, lip curling. "For now." Cersei's jaw clenched so hard Daenerys thought she might crack her teeth. But at last, she bent her knee as well, her gaze never leaving Daenerys's face. "We yield," she said softly, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "May the gods have mercy on us all." In that moment, the dream Daenerys had carried across the narrow sea burst into reality. The Lannisters had bent the knee. The Red Keep was hers for the taking. Though she felt no exultation, only a grim sense of inevitability. She gestured to Yora. Disarm them, confine them to their quarters under guard. Any sign of treachery, they die. Yora bowed. The Dothraki spread through the throne room, seizing swords and ensuring no hidden daggers lurked. The king's guard made no move to resist, though some glowered. Cersei allowed herself to be led away, venom smoldering in her eyes. Joffrey glared at Daenerys, as if to memorize her face for future vengeance. She set her shoulders, ignoring him. She turned instead to Ned Stark, who still stood manacled. She motioned to a guard, who brought her a key. She unlocked the manacle, letting it clatter to the ground. "For your loyalty," she said. "You are free." Ned nodded stiffly, rubbing his wrist. He looked to the side, where a swirl of Lannister guards parted to reveal Sansa Stark, trembling and tear-streaked, rushing forward. "Father!" she cried, throwing herself into his arms. He held her close, face etched with relief. Daenerys watched, feeling a subtle ache. Rhaego was so small still, but she knew the bond of parent and child transcended all. If she could ease this family's suffering, perhaps she was doing something right. The tension in the throne room ebbed slightly. The dais leading to the Iron Throne remained empty now that Joffrey had been pulled aside. Daenerys took a step toward it, heart pounding. Her father's seat, her birthright. She recalled how Aegon had forged it from the swords of those he had conquered. An uncomfortable seat meant to remind rulers that power should never be taken lightly. She placed a hand on one twisted, blackened blade that jutted from the side. Felt cold to the touch. She ascended the steps slowly. Each footfall rang in her ears. At the top, she turned, letting her gaze sweep the throne room. Jorah Mormont stood near the foot of the dais, flanked by Dothraki warriors. Ned Stark remained, holding Sansa, looking up at her with a grave expression. The Lannister guards had been relieved of their weapons by Dothraki. Some onlookers, small folk or servants who had been cowering in corners, peered out wide-eyed. Daenerys reached out and gripped the Iron Throne's edge. The metal pricked her palm, a small, sharp sting. She drew in a breath, ignoring the pain. "For years," she said, voice resonating in the silent hall, "my house has been exiled. The usurper seized my father's throne, and the realm has endured the tyranny and wars that followed. Now I, Daenerys Targaryen, have returned to claim what is mine by blood and by right. Henceforth I am your queen. Any who defy me will face the same end as those who defied me at the gates. But to those who kneel, I offer mercy and the promise of a fair rule." She paused, letting her gaze linger over them. "This city will not burn as it did under my father's madness. I will not be the Queen of Ashes." A murmur rippled among the watchers. Jorah lowered himself to one knee. Aggo, Kotho, and Rakaro followed suit. Ned Stark hesitated, then slowly bent his knee, bowing his head. The rest of the guards and onlookers, uncertain or fearful, followed suit. A swirl of emotion flooded Daenerys. Triumph, sorrow, relief, and a strange sense of loneliness at the top of this dais. She thought of Drogo, of Viserys, of the child Rhaego who waited for her outside these walls. She wished Drogo could see this moment. She wished someone from her old life could stand beside her and share it. She had Ser Jorah, loyal but tortured by his own past. She had Ned Stark, a man who had fought her house once, but who might now be her staunch ally. She had her Dothraki. She had her dragons. Perhaps that would be enough. She turned, seating herself on the Iron Throne. The seat of blades was hard and uncomfortable beneath her, each edge a subtle threat. She folded her hands in her lap, back straight, and gazed out at the kneeling figures. "Rise," she said at last. "There is much work to be done to restore order to this city. We must feed the hungry, bury the dead, and see that justice is done." Ned Stark lifted his head. "Your Grace," he said, his voice careful, "I am no friend to the Lannisters, nor a friend to cruel rulers. If you wish the realm's acceptance, you must act justly. Show them you are not the Mad King's daughter. Show them you mean what you say. Mercy for those who kneel, punishment for the guilty alone." Daenerys nodded. She was grateful to hear him speak so plainly. "That is my intention, Lord Stark. I would have you serve as my hand, if you will. Your honor is known throughout the realm. Help me rebuild what has been broken." A flicker of grief crossed his features. "I served as Robert's hand once. It led me here to heartbreak and betrayal. But if you would truly govern with justice—" He glanced at Sansa, who clung to his side, and then back to Daenerys. "I will serve as best I can." She inclined her head. "Then let it be so. Ser Jorah, ensure the city watch and any loyal men of the realm maintain order in the streets. Proclaim that I am queen and that any who resist will face the crown's wrath. But do not kill those who lay down their arms. If your Dothraki violate these commands, punish them as I have decreed." Jorah bowed. "Yes, your grace." Daenerys looked to the cluster of Lannister guards who had not yet been dismissed. "Take Cersei Lannister and Joffrey Baratheon to secure quarters. They are to remain under guard until I decide their fate. No harm is to come to them unless they attempt to escape." One guard opened his mouth as if to protest, but Ned Stark stepped forward. "You heard the queen. Obey." The guard closed his mouth, glanced at the ring of Dothraki, and then bobbed his head. With the immediate commands given, Daenerys felt the enormity of the moment pressing on her shoulders like a physical weight. The Iron Throne was hers, but the realm was not yet won. She had no illusions about the challenges that loomed. Renly Baratheon and Stannis Baratheon would see her as a threat. Tywin Lannister might still gather an army. The North might follow Ned Stark if he asked, but the Tullys, the Tyrells, the Martells, the Greyjoys, all had their own ambitions and grievances. Moreover, winter might be coming, as the Starks so often said. And beyond the realm's petty wars, darker rumors stirred from the far north. The White Walkers. She remembered hearing half-whispered stories in the east, but no one took them seriously here. Perhaps they should. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, hearing the distant clang of swords from the city outside, the cries of the wounded. This was only the beginning, but she was not alone. She had her child, she had the Dothraki, she had Ned Stark's council, and she had dragons, small now but destined to grow. Perhaps that would be enough to hold the realm together and face whatever came next. When she opened her eyes again, she found Ned Stark waiting, Sansa at his side. Jorah hovered nearby with the Dothraki, each uncertain of this new order. The clang of metal echoed from the corridors as more Dothraki poured in, cheering their victory, brandishing stolen helmets or bits of Lannister gold. Daenerys knew she would have to restore discipline quickly, but for a moment she let them revel, for this was a turning point in history. A Targaryen sat the Iron Throne again. She lifted her chin, calling out in a firm voice, "This is the seat of House Targaryen, and I am Daenerys Stormborn, first of my name, Queen of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, and Protector of the Realm. All who live in these 7 kingdoms are my people now. Those who would bring harm to them shall face my justice. So I swear, in the sight of the gods old and new." Her vow hung in the air, resonant. Some of the kneeling men bowed their heads deeper, as if acknowledging a sacred moment. Others looked uncertain, but the words were spoken. The realm would judge her by her deeds, not merely her lineage. She thought of Rhaego, safe in the camp beyond the walls, and the dragons that awaited her return. She would forge a new era or die in the attempt. In the days that followed, the city stilled under Daenerys' control. Clashes continued in pockets, but Ned Stark worked tirelessly to bring the gold cloaks under the Queen's banner. The Dothraki scoured the streets for Lannister loyalists who refused to yield. Joffrey and Cersei were confined to luxurious but secured chambers in Maegor's Holdfast, stripped of any power to command. Sansa Stark was allowed to reunite with her father, tearful and relieved. Daenerys' name spread among the small folk. Some cursed her as the foreign queen. Others lauded her for ending the siege quickly and preventing a complete sack of the city. Word traveled across the realm like wildfire. Daenerys Targaryen had taken King's Landing. Robert was dead, Joffrey dethroned, and a new queen sat upon the Iron Throne. Inside the Red Keep, Daenerys found herself spending restless nights walking the halls that had once belonged to her family. She gazed upon old tapestries in dim corridors, trying to piece together the lineage that had led her here. She found abandoned rooms that still bore the sigils of House Targaryen, hidden behind more recent Baratheon heraldry. The dragons that had once adorned the walls were chipped, defaced by those who had hated her father. She felt an odd ache, a longing for the grandeur of a time she had never truly known. She missed Drogo. Every success felt incomplete without him by her side. She took solace in Rhaego, in his small warm weight in her arms. She spent her time with the dragons as well, ensuring they were fed fresh meat. She marveled at their quick growth, or so it seemed to her eyes. Drogon, the Black One, was the largest, always hungry, always the first to hiss at a stranger. Rhaego, the Green Bronze, was quieter but watchful, his eyes tracking every movement in the chamber. Viserion, Cream and Gold, was the most vocal, squeaking incessantly if Daenerys left them too long. The castle folk whispered in awe and fear when she passed with a dragon perched on her shoulder. Some called her the Dragon Queen. Others muttered about waking ancient horrors. Despy, the hush of victory. Threats loomed. Reports reached her that Renly Baratheon had crowned himself king in Highgarden, forging an alliance with the Tyrells. Stannis Baratheon refused to acknowledge her claim, holding Dragonstone with a fleet behind him. Tywin Lannister and Jaime Lannister were said to be gathering forces in the west. Robb Stark was but a boy in Winterfell, rumored to be calling his banners. And the Martells in Dorne remained silent, remembering the deaths of Elia Martell and her children during the sack of King's Landing long ago. The realm stood on the edge of new conflicts, any of which could ignite a war more devastating than the one she had narrowly averted. Daenerys summoned her new hand, Ned Stark, to discuss letters that demanded her attention. They met in the small council chamber, once presided over by Robert and his courtiers. Now only a few seats were filled: Stark, Jorah Mormont, and 2 men of the City Watch who had been elevated to keep order. Daenerys sat at the head of the table, posture regal, but heart thrumming with tension. She looked at Ned Stark, seeing the worry lines etched on his face. She sensed he was deeply torn. He had fought against Targaryen rule in the past, had followed Robert in rebellion. Now he served a Targaryen queen. Duty bound him, but she knew he must question everything. She slid a parchment across the table. "A raven from Highgarden," she said. "Renly Baratheon styles himself king of the 7 kingdoms, with Margaery Tyrell as his queen. He calls for my removal, though his letter is more politely worded than I expected." She allowed herself a small, humorless smile. Ned grimaced. Renly was always charming, but that does not mean he will yield. With the Tyrells behind him, he can muster a large army. And I suspect they feel no loyalty to a Targaryen after Robert's victory all those years ago. Daenerys nodded. "He suggests we meet and discuss a compromise. I do not trust it. He claims an equal right to the throne by virtue of Robert's bloodline." Jorah cleared his throat. "He can claim what he likes, but legally speaking, you have the stronger claim. Robert seized it by right of conquest, and now you have conquered Robert's heir. That same logic might support your rule. The question is, do we want to fight another war to prove it?" A heavy silence descended. Daenerys thought of the battered city, the corpses still being carted away. "Another war could break the realm," she said quietly. "We must choose carefully. If I meet with Renly and he proves honorable, perhaps we can negotiate. If not," Ned rubbed his temples, "Renly is not a fool, nor is Mace Tyrell. They might believe that with your Dothraki so far from home, they can starve you out if they retake the farmland in the Reach. The city itself cannot feed an entire Khalasar for long. They could besiege us from the outside if they gather enough allies." A flicker of anxiety crossed Daenerys' heart. She recalled how meager the city's grain stores already were. The approach of winter would worsen matters. "We might need to send riders to secure the Rose Road or gather supplies from the Crownlands. The Dothraki are skilled at foraging, but that is not enough to support a city of hundreds of thousands." Ned nodded. "We can try to restore the city markets, but it will take time. Until then, we risk discontent among the small folk. They have endured too much. I do not wish to see them suffer anew. If they starve, they could riot, and a riot in King's Landing can claim many lives. I've seen it before." Daenerys pressed her lips together. She had dreamt of taking the throne for so long, but the complexity of rule weighed on her now. "Then let us gather the houses that remain loyal to the Targaryen name. We must re-establish the crown's authority. We can try to open negotiations with the Tyrells, the Martells, even the Arryns, any who might prefer a Targaryen restoration to further war. If we can unify enough of them, Renly might think twice before launching an attack." Ned gave a measured nod. "I will pen letters at once. We can see which houses answer." She rubbed her temple, feeling the swirl of politics envelop her. This was not like the Dothraki Sea, where might alone determined leadership. This was Westeros, with all its feudal loyalties and layered grudges. She missed Drogo's straightforward confidence. She missed the single-minded drive that had brought her here. Now every step was a labyrinth. A brief rap on the chamber door interrupted them. One of the city watch stepped in, bowing awkwardly. "Your Grace, Lord Stark, Ser Jorah, there's a messenger at the gate. He bears the sigil of House Lannister." Ned stiffened. "Which Lannister?" The guard swallowed. "He says he rides for Lord Tywin. He wishes audience with the Queen." Daenerys and Ned exchanged a glance. Jorah let out a breath. "So it begins," he muttered. She rose from her seat, squaring her shoulders. "Show him to the throne room. I will hear what Lord Tywin has to say." They went at once, crossing corridors still haunted by the aftermath of battle. The messenger waited in the echoing hall, an older knight in burnished armor, 100 years old, with short-cropped gray hair. He bowed as Daenerys entered, flanked by Ned Stark, Jorah, and the Dothraki guard. "Your Grace," the knight said, his tone carefully respectful. "I am Ser Adam Brax, sent by Lord Tywin Lannister to treat with you." Daenerys took her seat on the Iron Throne, biting back a wince at the jagged metal that dug into her back. "Speak then," she commanded. "What does Tywin Lannister propose?" The knight drew a parchment from his belt. "Lord Tywin acknowledges that you hold King's Landing. He offers terms. If you release Cersei Lannister and Joffrey Baratheon unharmed, and allow them safe passage to Casterly Rock, he will not contest your rule over the Crownlands. He further offers not to advance on the city, provided his bannermen in the west are left unmolested and free from your Dothraki raids." A hush settled. Daenerys felt Ned Stark's tension beside her. She lifted her gaze from the knight to regard him coldly. "So, in exchange for not attacking the capital, Tywin wants me to release his daughter and grandson, and leave him be in the west. What of the rest of the realm? Does he suggest we divide the kingdom between us?" Ser Adam cleared his throat. "My lord does not presume to speak for the Baratheons or the Tyrells or the other great houses. He wishes only to secure his own territory. He acknowledges your presence on the throne, so long as his family is safe." Daenerys considered the offer. It would, in theory, remove the immediate threat of Tywin's army marching on King's Landing. But it would also leave a proud, dangerous adversary free to plot revenge. Ned Stark's expression revealed his distaste. He stepped forward slightly, voice carrying through the hall. Would Lord Tywin face justice for his crimes? He sacked the city once before under King Aerys, and his men murdered the children of Prince Rhaegar. He's not a man to be trusted, Your Grace. Daenerys felt a stab of anger at the mention of Rhaegar's children, murdered by the Mountain and the Lannisters. She turned to Ser Adam, letting her eyes blaze. And what of justice for Elia Martell and her children? For the horrors House Lannister inflicted on my family? The knight swallowed. My lord regrets many things that were done in the heat of Robert's rebellion. But a queen must consider the good of the realm, not vengeance for old wounds. He lifted his chin. Lord Tywin offers peace. If you deny him, he will march. Daenerys resisted the urge to fling a retort. She had Ned Stark and Jorah to consider, the battered city's condition, the dragons, Renly's threat, and the possibility of more war. She glanced at Ned, reading the tension in his posture. He hated Tywin Lannister and all he stood for, but a fresh war with the West might leave kings landing vulnerable to Renly or Stannis. Could she handle 2 or 3 wars at once, with no allies but the Dothraki and some uncertain city watch? She drew a breath. "I will not trade justice for convenience," she said, letting the echo of her voice fill the hall. "Yet I see the wisdom in securing the peace for now. Tell Lord Tywin that I will consider his terms. He will have my answer in 1 fortnight. Until then, neither he nor I will undertake hostile actions. If he marches before that time, I will execute Cersei and Joffrey. If he abides, I will guarantee they remain unharmed." Ser Adam nodded slowly. "I shall convey your words, your grace." "Good," Daenerys said. "You may depart at once." He bowed, turned on his heel, and left under guard. When the doors closed behind him, Daenerys slumped slightly against the cool metal of the throne. Ned Stark eyed her with approval. "You did not yield, nor did you trap us in another war. A wise balance." She managed a wan smile. "1 fortnight's respite, if Tywin keeps his word. That is all. We must use it well. Shore up the city, gather allies, perhaps even reach out to the Martells. They have reason to hate the Lannisters more than most." Ned nodded. "I can send an envoy to Dorne. If Prince Doran Martell remembers the fate of his sister and her children, he might join you in a pact against the Lannisters." A sense of cautious hope flickered in Daenerys' chest. Allies, that was what she needed. She looked at Yora. "And to the Riverlands as well. Perhaps the Tullus would consider joining me, especially if you speak on my behalf, Lord Stark." He inclined his head. "Lady Catelyn is of House Tully. I will try." Daenerys stood, stepping down from the throne. "Then see it done. Meanwhile, we must ensure the city does not starve. I will speak with the master of the city's granaries, if such a man still lives, and see what can be salvaged. Perhaps we can negotiate for shipments from the Vale or the Stormlands, but that means talking to Renly or Lisa Arryn." The game widens. Ned Stark offered a faint smile. "You are learning quickly, your grace. The Iron Throne is easier seized than held, as Robert discovered." She paused at the foot of the dais, exhaling slowly. "I wonder if I would have done better to remain across the sea, building more alliances before coming here." Yora stepped close enough to murmur, "We cannot dwell on that now. You have the throne. Best to keep it. Let each day we hold it strengthen your claim." She glanced at him, recalling how long he had served her. "Yes," she said, "I will not abandon what so many have died for. I will hold it until the realm is truly at peace. Or until I am dead," she added silently. They left the throne room, each with tasks swirling in their minds. The corridors felt claustrophobic, the walls thick with decades of intrigue. Daenerys thought of the wide skies of Essos, the open plains of the Dothraki Sea, and realized that she would likely never ride so free again. This castle, this city, these 7 kingdoms, they would be her burden and her destiny. She prayed she had the strength to bear it. Days turned into a flurry of administration. Ned Stark dove into the role of hand with a grim determination. He oversaw the reorganization of the gold cloaks, the distribution of food to hungry small folk, the cleaning of the streets from the carnage left by the invasion. Gradually, a semblance of order returned. Daenerys had signs posted throughout the city, proclaiming that any crimes against civilians would be punished by the Queen's justice, whether committed by Dothraki or by City Watch. A few Dothraki broke her law, raping or killing out of habit, and she executed them swiftly. It shocked many, but it showed that she meant her word. No one was above the law. Ned Stark approved, though it pained him to see more bloodshed. Meanwhile, Daenerys paid close attention to her dragons, feeding them regularly. She had them moved to a warm solarium within the Red Keep, where large windows admitted sunlight. They perched on heated stones, flapping tiny wings. Some of the castle staff gawked, crossing themselves for protection against what they called demons. Daenerys let them look, wanting the realm to see that the dragons were real. The symbol of House Targaryen, returned to life. Each day, she felt them grow bolder, snapping at each other over bits of meat, scuttling around the floor. Drogon sometimes crawled onto her shoulder unbidden, hissing at anyone who approached too closely. She allowed it. He was a part of her identity now, a piece of the legacy she must uphold. Rhaego remained in her chambers, tended by a small retinue of nurses. She spent every spare moment with him, singing Valyrian lullabies, letting him grip her finger with his tiny hand. He had Drogo's dark eyes, but hints of Targaryen silver in his hair. Sometimes, gazing upon him, she felt a pang of both love and grief that nearly unmanned her. For his sake, she told herself, she would fight any war that came. She would build a realm worthy of his inheritance. As the days ticked by, no word came from Tywin Lannister, nor from Renly, nor from Stannis. Daenerys awaited ravens with mounting tension. If Tywin marched, she would need to keep Joffrey and Cersei under the threat of execution to deter him. If Renly decided to press forward, she might face a two-front war. Still, the city stabilized, and letters from other corners of the realm trickled in. Some houses declared for her, others claimed neutrality, and a few expressed veiled hostility. She tried to map alliances on parchment in her solar, but it felt like chasing a swarm of bees. The realm was too vast, too fragmented. One evening, she stood on a balcony overlooking Blackwater Bay. The waters shone dark under the moonlight. She could smell the salt air, hear distant gulls. Jorah approached quietly. "Your Grace," he said, "I wanted to let you know. Your dragons are restless tonight." She turned, frowning. "Restless how? They keep screeching, flapping around their enclosure. The servants are worried. Might you calm them?" She sighed, nodding. "Yes, I'll come." They walked through the torchlit corridors to the solarium. The moment Daenerys entered, she heard sharp hissing and squeaking. The three hatchlings were on the floor, arrayed around a brazier's glowing coals, as if disturbed by something. Their eyes flicked to her, and they made plaintive noises. Drogon waddled forward, then leapt awkwardly, beating wings, and latched onto her leg. She bent to stroke him gently. "What is it?" she murmured in Valyrian. "Hush, I'm here." Viserion and Rhaego chimed in, scuttling about. Daenerys felt an inexplicable surge of emotion. She knelt between them, letting them crawl up her arms. Jorah stood aside, watchful. She closed her eyes, sensing a strange warmth radiate from them. Perhaps they felt the tension in the castle, the undercurrent of looming war. They were creatures of magic, and the realm was stirring with conflict. "You belong here," she whispered to them. "We all do for now." She thought of the day she had walked into Drogo's pyre. She had survived flame and hatched dragons, forging a destiny few had thought possible. Now the crown weighed heavily on her brow, an invisible burden. The dragons squeaked, pressing close to her. She realized she felt no fear of them, only a deep, abiding sense that they were part of her soul. Jorah cleared his throat. "Are you all right, Your Grace? You seem troubled." She opened her eyes. "I am. I see how precarious this throne is, how easily everything could unravel. And sometimes, I wonder if I'm the right person to hold it." He hesitated. "You are the rightful queen by blood and by conquest. You have shown more compassion than your father ever did." She set the dragons gently down. Drogon snarled at being separated, but she stroked his head, soothing him. "I only hope it is enough. The storms of war gather, and no one can see the shape of what is coming." Jorah had no easy answer. The night pressed close around them, the braziers flickering against the stone walls. After a moment, she rose. "Tomorrow, I will gather the council. We must plan for Tywin's reply, or for Renly's next move. If war is coming, we will meet it with clear eyes. Dothraki do not flinch from battle. Nor shall I." He inclined his head. "Yes, Your Grace." She left the solarium, the dragons settling behind her with only faint squeaks of protest. The corridor felt cool as she made her way back toward her chambers. She paused by a high window overlooking the city. Beyond the rooftops, Tiny lights glowed where people huddled in their homes. This was her realm now. She bore the responsibility for all those lives. Once, in her innocence, she had believed reclaiming the throne would be a glorious destiny. Now she understood it was a burden that required every scrap of will and wisdom she possessed. Still, she did not regret crossing the narrow sea before the realm was torn by the War of the Five Kings. She had preempted that conflict. In its place, she now wrestled a fractured piece from the jaws of chaos. Perhaps that was better than letting the lords tear each other apart. Perhaps she could save Westeros from itself. And if the tales of the White Walkers proved true, if the real war lay to the north, then she would need a united kingdom to face it. No matter how many battles it took, no matter how many alliances she forged or broke, she would see the realms stand against the greater darkness. She walked on to her chambers. Rhaego lay asleep in a small cradle near her bed, his soft breathing a balm to her weary spirit. She bent and stroked his cheek. "I do this for you," she whispered, "so that one day you might rule a kingdom that is whole, a kingdom that does not tremble at the sound of armies or the flicker of wildfire, a kingdom that might know peace." He stirred, but did not wake. She sank onto the edge of her bed, exhaustion nipping at her every joint. She let herself relax, if only for a moment. Drogo's memory flickered in her mind, reminding her of a fierce love and a promise of conquest. She had fulfilled the conquest or part of it. The love she carried in her heart, even now. Outside, the night pressed on, silent yet charged with potential. Daenerys Stormborn, Khaleesi, Queen, Mother of Dragons, felt the weight of all the tomorrows yet to come. She inhaled slowly, exhaled, and willed herself to find strength in the calm. The day had been won, the city taken. It was enough for this moment. Tomorrow's battles would wait. In the darkness, her child slept, her dragons dreamt of flight, and the Iron Throne stood in the throne room below like a challenge that would never end. But as she closed her eyes, Daenerys Targaryen dared to hope that she might be the queen who would save the Seven Kingdoms from the fires of war. Both the wars of men and the war that legend said would come with the long night. Whether she succeeded or failed, her name would echo across the ages. A Stormborn queen who had gambled everything for a land she had never truly known, and for a future she refused to abandon. And in that hush, the City of Kings Landing slept under new rule, waiting to see what the Dragon Queen's reign might bring. The soft breathing of her child became the lullaby that drew Daenerys into her own uneasy rest. Dreams tinged with the red-gold flicker of dragons dancing in starlight, and a whisper of wind that spoke of distant winter snows.